On June 25th, 2020, the Walt Disney Company announced the closure of one of their most popular but controversial rides of all time, Splash Mountain. It was especially noteworthy that the ride, which was criticized for its racial insensitivity, would be replaced by a ride about a movie featuring Disney's first black princess, Tiana. Now, anyone would expect backlash for such a political move, but what started as backlash quickly turned into a proxy war between the American right and left. What happened with Splash Mountain was in many ways art imitating life, which is why I think an analysis of what the hell happened is so warranted. If you just want the basics, then Splash Mountain got replaced by Princess and the Frog. There you go, I saved you 90 minutes to 2 hours. What I want to answer is why Splash Mountain got replaced, and the answer involves a complicated mix of history, politics, and a lot of aggrieved Disney adults. I was fortunate enough to have recently experienced both versions of the attraction and was deep in the trenches for all of the mind-numbingly dumb discourse surrounding the ride update. So I wanted to do a deep dive into this ride, how it represents real American politics, and then look at the final product to evaluate if the Great Tiana's experiment was a success. So before we even talk about Splash Mountain, we need to talk about the root of all of this, Splash Mountain source material, Song of the South. There's a lot of mystique and infamy surrounding this movie, mostly because for most people, especially my age and younger, this movie was just not readily available to watch. Disney began suppressing the film from being released in theaters in 1986, and it never even got an American home video release. But in previous generations, this movie was seen as a classic. Brer Fox and Brer Bear were once ubiquitous Disney characters, but to me, they were just those guys from Splash Mountain. When I was younger, to me, Splash Mountain may as well have been an original IP because I just did not know those characters, and to be honest, if all the contents of the ride remained the same and there was no racist movie behind it, it would probably still be standing today. Now, the obvious question whenever anyone brings up Song of the South is, what is this movie and why is it so racist? So for this part of the video, I wanted to actually sit down and watch Song of the South for the first time, as well as talk about its production, because these are going to be key in evaluating Splash Mountain down the line. And honestly, I was pretty shocked by what I saw and researched, and it's no wonder that Splash Mountain eventually became marred in controversy. Song of the South is based on a collection of stories written by Joel Chandler Harris. Harris was a journalist who created an anthology of various retold slave stories tied together by the narrator Uncle Remus. The film was ultimately released in 1946, but its production started during World War II. At this point in the company's history, Disney's finances were strained. Disney couldn't get their movies into foreign markets, and aside from World War II training and propaganda films that Disney produced for the government that basically only broke even, there wasn't much new creativity coming out of the company. And to be fair, World War II seems like a pretty difficult time to try to be creative, but Disney was trying. Like most of Disney's classic films, the concept for Song of the South was adapted from a book, and the film rights were purchased from the Harris family. There were a number of directions considered for Song of the South, including all animation or just splitting the stories up into individual shorts. Ultimately, it was decided that the movie would be 2/3 live action and 1/3 animation, in large part to cut costs. Once production began, a man named Dalton Raymond was brought on to write the screenplay. And this man was so good at his job that Song of the South was his first screenplay as well as his only screenplay. Let's just say that Raymond got a little too lost in the sauce with some of the terminology he included in the original script. For pigmentation reasons, I will not be repeating the words that were included, but you can imagine that if it was too racist for 1940s Hollywood, it must have been pretty bad. Eventually, Disney hired black performer Clarence Muse to kind of help dull Raymond's edge, but he eventually quit because Raymond refused to portray any of the black characters as anything other than racist stereotypes. Disney responded to this allegation by saying that Muse was just upset that he didn't get the part of Uncle Remus, and so he was lashing back at the company. So, not a great response by Disney. Disney then brought in another person to kind of rein Raymond in, this time a white person named Maurice Rapf. Rapf made some brilliant contributions to the script, like eliminating words like massa, including heavy-handed dialogue that indicated that everyone in the movie was there of their own free will and that slavery was over. Now, this part I want to read verbatim from the Song of the South Wikipedia page. Rapf saw the animal stories as metaphors for slave resistance and intended to portray Brer Rabbit as a smaller, less powerful black man. Okay, right on. Shout out to woke Raph. And in place of the oppressive whites would be Brer Fox, Brer Bear, and the deleted character Brer. Now, I'm going to be walking through a lot of landmines in this video. I am not touching that one. So as you can already tell, just at the foundation, this is already a very troubled and racist film. And it almost didn't even matter how the movie turned out from here. The core was rotten. And it's this domino falling that ultimately results in grown men 80 years later weeping on Twitter about a ride closure. Now, the actual production of Splash Mountain was a lot less dramatic. James Baskett was cast as Uncle Remus and undoubtedly was the highlight of this movie. To Walt Disney's credit, he campaigned for Baskett to get an Oscar for his performance and was a good friend of Baskett up until his death. Baskett was infamously not allowed to attend the premiere for the movie he earned an Academy Award for because the premiere was held in Atlanta, which was still segregated at the time. The movie was a financial hit, earning $65 million on a $2 million budget. But even in the 1940s, it was already garnering controversy for its racist depictions of black people. Detractors at the time took issue with the fact that despite earlier versions of the script containing clarification that this was post-slavery and that no one in the movie were slaves, there's no explicit confirmation like this in the final film. Song of the South was not a movie that was totally accepted up until woke modern America got a hold of it. It was called out as being racist from the jump. Now at this point, I know what you're all thinking. You want to know a white man's opinion about how racist this movie is. And don't worry, I got you. So after all these years by hearing about this movie, I sat down on my computer, Googled Song of the South 4K, and saw what all the hubbub was really about. The best way that I could describe Song of the South, at least the live action portions, is it's the kind of sleep-inducing movie that your homeroom teacher forces you to watch after recess across 3 excruciating days. And while I don't want to get too bogged down in this movie, I do want to touch on just some basic plot points because I think it's important to understanding the whole splash debate later on. Song of the South follows a white boy named Johnny who is taken to his grandmother's Georgian plantation. He assumes it's for a family vacation, but his dad leaves suddenly, leaving Johnny isolated and lonely. He eventually comes across a group of workers and strikes a friendship with Uncle Remus, a storyteller, and a younger worker named Toby. When Uncle Remus tells a story, the movie transitions into its first animated segment. The animated sections follow the tales of Brer Rabbit as he has to use his wit and cunning to outsmart Brer Fox and Brer Bear, who explicitly state throughout the movie how bad they want to torture, kill, and eat him.
Cause I'm gonna barbecue you this very minute. Maybe I'll hang him. That's it! I'll hang him! Hang him by the neck till he's dead.
You just gonna knock his head clean off.
About midway through the film, the movie introduces Johnny's love interest, Ginny. She's given a puppy by her mother, and her 2 older brothers try to drown it. Ginny gives the puppy to Johnny, and there's a plot thread where the 2 brothers are trying to get the dog back from Ginny. Ginny tells Johnny that if her brothers give him trouble to let her mom know, since the dog belongs to Ginny and her mother would take her side. When Johnny tells this to Uncle Remus, he tells him the story of the tar baby, where Brer Rabbit uses reverse psychology to get Brer Fox to throw him into the briar patch.
Brother Fox, I mean, whatever you do, Brother Fox, whatever you do, please, Brother Fox, please don't fling me in that briar patch. Briar patch?
Which is the same scene as the climax of Splash Mountain. When the bullies confront Johnny to get the dog back, Johnny also uses reverse psychology and begs them not to tell their mom that Ginny gave her dog to Johnny. When the boys tell their mom, she beats them and tells them that it was Ginny's dog and she's welcome to give it to Johnny if she wants. The bigger one says that they can't blame Johnny because he warned them not to tell their mom, but the smaller one chides him and points out that that's exactly what Johnny wanted. This scene establishes that Johnny and Ginny's 2 brothers are supposed to parallel Brer Fox, Brer Rabbit, and Brer Bear. In the last act of the story, Johnny's mother tells Remus to stop telling stories to Johnny since he's becoming a bad influence, and Remus agrees. Johnny's mom throws him a birthday party, and on the way, Ginny is stopped by her brothers and gets pushed into the mud. Johnny tries to cheer her up by telling her a story about Brer Rabbit. Remus recognizes that he's using his stories to comfort Ginny and joins him in telling the 3rd and final Brer Rabbit tale. Johnny's mom finds out that he was spending time with Remus instead of being at his own birthday party and warns Remus to never talk to Johnny again. Remus decides to leave the plantation for Atlanta, but Johnny chases him. While chasing Remus, Johnny then gets attacked by a bull, which is set up earlier in the movie. Then all of the workers come together in song for Johnny, who I guess is in a coma. Remus comes to Johnny's bedside and starts to tell him another story, which wakes him up. In the finale, Remus, Johnny, Ginny, the dog, and all the animated critters skip into the sunset to the tune of Zippity Doo Dah. The central theme of the story is about the ability for folktales to heal and bring us together. Johnny, lacking the prejudice of older white people, strikes a friendship with Remus and finds that Remus has a lot to teach him. He applies the lessons in the Uncle Remus tales to his real-life conflicts and eventually tries to emulate Remus's storytelling to comfort others in the same way he was comforted by Uncle Remus. And while I would argue that this theme is a bit simplistic and antiquated, it is a positive message at its core. And as we'll see, this is a narrative that the Save Splash Mountain crowd brings up all the time when people talk about the racist nature of this movie. However, just because the main message of a movie is positive, that in no way absolves it of being problematic. That's like if I made a kids movie where the core message was sharing is caring, but every character is like a racist caricature. That doesn't magically make my movie inoffensive. And applying that to Song of the South, there's plenty that you can point to that would be considered harmful. First, as we touched on earlier, there's no explicit confirmation of when this movie takes place and if the black characters in this movie are slaves or not. The only thing I can think of is that Remus does leave the plantation of his own free will at the end of the movie. You could say that this then makes Remus a sharecropper, but any casual viewer would just assume that Remus and every other black character are all just really happy slaves. The blue-collar work in the movie is done exclusively by the black characters, and there's this subtle implied deference whenever a black character is talking to a white character.
I know you mean well, Uncle Remus, but Johnny's too young.
Miss Sally.
I'll have to ask you not to tell him any more.
Yes, Miss Sally.
The lines in the script, which clarified that the movie was supposed to take place post-emancipation, were cut, so you have to wonder how intentional this confusion was. If this movie was supposed to be this celebration of black folklore, like some people claim that it is, and it's just about the ability for an older black man and a young white boy to be friends together, don't you think in the 1940s you'd want to make the time period explicitly clear? Even back at the time, people assumed this movie took place in the antebellum South. Hell, even ChatGPT thinks that. So yeah, I can't help but think that the lack of clarity about this was intentional. The other thing that jumps out at you when you watch this movie is how characters talk. So I believe the correct term is AAVE, or African American Vernacular English. AAVE in general refers to the traditional black dialect, even what's spoken today. The dialogue in Song of the South from the black characters is this extremely exaggerated form of AAVE, which honestly feels more like a caricature.
I say, if you seen Johnny, poor Miss Sally, she's been looking high and low for that child.
You sure ain't been down here listening to one of your tales?
Of course, that when I see it. How come you let that boy get out of your sight? Didn't Miss Doshi tell you to take care of him?
Come on, Chloe, us got to find him before Miss Sally goes out of her mind.
Is this tempting? I said it before, I says it now, and I says it again. There never was a better cook in these here parts than nowhere else. See?
What's the matter with you? I said howdy. Is you hard of hearing? I said howdy.
The inclusion of AAVE was actually a criticism of the original Uncle Remus stories, but I guess Disney just thought this was an essential part of the story that they just simply could not alter for their version. Defenders of Song of the South and the original Uncle Remus tales argue that this AAVE dialect is appropriate because this is just how black people talked at the time. Now, I wasn't there, and it's certainly not my place to say whether or not this AAVE is offensive or not. However, there's just something so cringe-inducing about watching black characters talk like this in a script written by white people based on a story that was also written by a white man. But by far, probably the worst thing about Song of the South is that there was no post-credit scene. So now that we've established what Song of the South was and why it was offensive, let's get back to the subject of our video, Splash Mountain. Now this won't be an exhaustive history on Splash Mountain because God knows there's a million other videos on YouTube about that, but I just want to cover the basics that I think are important. The concept of Splash Mountain came from the debatable goat of modern Imagineering, Tony Baxter. The goal was to come up with an attraction that would pull guests into the dead area in the back of the park, Critter Country, or now Bayou Country as it's known, post-November 2024. Dick Nunes, the president of park operations, insisted that Disneyland needed a log flume ride. So Tony Baxter conceptualized a log flume with characters based on the animated portions of Song of the South. This also came with the convenience of being able to repurpose the figures from the middling Tomorrowland show America Sings. Mark Davis, another debatable Imagineering goat, did the major design concepts for America Sings, and he also worked on designs for Song of the South, so the figures from America Sings would blend seamlessly with the art direction of the ride. One thing that surprised me in my research was that Disney was 100% aware that Song of the South was a controversial film. When you engage with Splash Mountain discourse, there's this narrative that pro-splashers bring up that back in the 80s, everyone was just cool with Song of the South, and it wasn't until the woke mob got a hold of it that Disney had to cave into their demands. But while Disney didn't anticipate pushback at the time, they were certainly aware that it could happen. Newspaper articles, as well as the Tar Baby scene, which was changed in the ride for obvious reasons, are evidence of this. So at the end of the day, Disney does deserve fault for opening an attraction based on a film that they knew was racist. And on July 17th, 1989, the first Splash Mountain opened in Disneyland. This was followed by Splash Mountain opening in October 1st, 1992 in Tokyo and October 2nd, 1992 in Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom. To the average guest, all these versions are identical. They each follow a loose amalgamation of the animated sequences from Song of the South. But there are some pretty key differences between each that I'll list just because I think they're interesting. Disneyland's version was characterized by its diverse cast of animals from America Sings. As I said before, these characters do fit perfectly from a visual perspective, but once you learn that they're repurposed from an entirely different attraction, you can kind of feel that something's off where you might not notice it, but your brain did. Also, as it's the first version, the Brer Fox and Brer Bear animatronics are noticeably rougher here, which is to be expected. There's also this kind of dark scene leading to the final drop where the mother opossum is morose over the possibility of Brer Rabbit being eaten.
What can Brer Rabbit do to keep from becoming rabbit stew?
She's a carryover from America Sings, and in my opinion is a great addition to the attraction. This is extremely nitpicky and nerdy, but I think it makes sense that if we see the critters throughout the beginning of the ride, it also makes sense to see them near the climax reacting to what's happening to Brer Rabbit. Both the Walt Disney World version and the Tokyo version cut this scene, which I think is a shame. But pretty much everything else is identical to the Walt Disney World version. The Magic Kingdom version has more advanced animatronics. You don't really fully appreciate the upgrade until you put the two rides side by side, and yeah, the Magic Kingdom ones just look so much more alive. You also get this cool hopping Brer Rabbit that's new to the Disney World version. And the Disney World version is also a little longer, so more bang for your weight. Also, I couldn't forget the iconic FSU chipmunk. Overall, very similar to the Disneyland version. The Tokyo Disneyland version is indisputably the greatest version of Splash Mountain. Now, for those who don't know, Tokyo Disneyland is not run by the Walt Disney Company, but the Oriental Land Company, or OLC. OLC put up the funds to build a Disney park in Tokyo, and their goal in soliciting Disney to build a park in Japan was to create uncompromised vision of a Western theme park in Eastern Japan. And as a result, the Tokyo Disneyland Resort is characterized by an insane level of detail and just the impression that no expense was spared in delivering the optimal guest experience, something that us Western park fans know nothing about. And Splash Mountain is no exception. First of all, the area around Splash Mountain is insanely detailed and the mountain itself is noticeably larger. There's also a damn restaurant inside, which is just sick. The ride is mostly in Japanese, but there is one scene where the English audio track can be heard. There's also some mildly interesting layout changes, like I like how close the initial round that you make around the mountain is to the other guests. Also interesting that it's going in the other direction of the other two splashes, which doesn't really mean anything, but I think it's pretty cool. If there is one negative, there's not as many random drops as in the other mountains, so it's arguably less thrilling, but this version more than makes up for it in production. Each scene feels more detailed and polished than any that have come before it. The figures are also really well maintained compared to how they looked here in the US near the end of their lives. If you look at any ride footage within at least 5 years of Splash's closing, you'll notice a lot of the figures either being stiff or in complete darkness because they're not operating. But that's not the case here. There is no darkness to be found here, and as you can see in this footage from 2024, you will not find any video of this high quality of any of the Western Splash figures moving this fluidly. The hopping Brer Rabbit is back, and the FSU Chipmunk again makes an appearance. I also love the fog here at the final drop. This is just so sick. And other than some orientation and scene swaps, the ride is, again, basically the same as the other two. You can really tell the contrast in budgets between both the US parks and the Japanese park, in that this ride is technically 1 day older than the Magic Kingdom version, but it looks 10 years younger. And the best part is, the characters speak in Japanese, so it's like I'm watching an anime, which is cool. But there's no subtitles, so I can't understand what they're saying, so it's not cool. Each version is just full of life, and you really feel like you're transported into a Disney cartoon. And despite Disney being the very best at taking their guests and making them feel like they've transported into another world, Splash somehow stood above all the rest of their attractions, which takes me to my next section. So what did I think about Splash Mountain? While I'll eventually be ripping into the mind-numbingly dumb discourse surrounding the Splash Mountain closure from the political right, I want to be transparent about my thoughts about it because I think that's very important in discussions like this. And if you couldn't already tell from my granular comparison about each version of the ride, I think that Splash Mountain was the greatest attraction that Disney ever built. I just want to break down why it was so special. Let's start with the story. It's actually very difficult to tell a clear story on a ride. because most rides are only about 2 to 3 minutes due to spatial concerns as well as the speed of the vehicles. Log flumes are an exception to this because they're both vertical as well as slow moving, so they can take up less horizontal space and tell a longer story. Splash took full advantage of this and as a result told the clearest ABC story you'll ever see in any attraction. Even the modern trackless dark rides like Rise of the Resistance that take up so much space don't read as well as Splash did. And when I say read, how a show reads is very important to theme park design and telling a story. Because guests might be riding past a scene in just seconds, the point of a scene or the gag of what's going on has to be immediately apparent. Even guests that haven't seen Song of the South, which was the majority of riders, can understand the existential conflict between Brer Fox, Brer Bear, and Brer Rabbit. And this clarity is in part due to the story, but also my next point, the set design. I remember watching one of those Disney Vacation DVDs, and a little girl on there simply put the Splash Mountain was like a cartoon, but it was real. And that seems so obvious, but just like the colors and the saturated palette that was used in that ride just transported you in a way that no other ride was ever able to. This, combined with the detailed set pieces and characters which naturally fit the art style of Song of the South, made each scene feel so alive. And finally, Splash just had the best pacing of any Disney ride. And to understand what I mean, try to imagine that you're a young child riding this for the first time and YouTube doesn't exist, so you can't watch a ride through of it, and you have no idea what's going to happen when you get in that log other than the huge drop that you saw walking past it. When you're in line, you see all these signs saying, "You will get wet," warning you about the drop you're about to take, including one of those signs which I proudly get to stare at every time I take a pee in the middle of the night. Once you hop on the ride and before you even enter a show scene, you're teased with the drop, reminding you of what you're about to face. And as a kid riding for the first time, your anxiety just builds, but it's the good kind of anxiety. It then leads you to a small drop that takes you into the first show scene. The tone changes as you hear "How do you do," and you're surrounded by lively animated characters. You see Brer Fox and Brer Bear, big and imposing, trying to catch Brer Rabbit. And all of a sudden, before you can realize what's ahead, you're surprised with a drop down, slip and falls, and into the Laugh-In Place. Again, you're surrounded by characters in this cave with all these water features. You feel like you're inside concept art. There is no seam in the immersion. But then, you see these foreboding vultures. That big drop you've been putting off is finally here. There's this ominous crackling of the chain lift as the vultures admonish you that your fun time is over. You hear Brer Rabbit beg for his life, and just as your log crests over the hill, you get an amazing view of the park. Finally, you splash down through the Briar Patch. Admittedly, the drop's not as intense as you thought, and you and your family get to let that sense of thrill marinate until you're brought into the final show scene. You get this grand finale with the steamboat, hens doing the can-can, and the iconic Zippity-Doo-Dah song. You see the final fate of Brer Fox and Brer Bear, Brer Rabbit returns home, and the imaginary credits roll. There's no other ride before or since that's been able to accomplish what Splash Mountain did, and while some have debatably come close, none have been able to put it all together in the way that Splash Mountain did. Now, why am I glazing Splash Mountain when I'm about to complain about all the man babies upset about its closure? It's because when evaluating a piece of media, I think it's important to be intellectually honest, even if you find it offensive or it's inconvenient for your political position. Before Splash Mountain closed, I did see a few grumblings online from people being like, "Yeah, I rode Splash one final time before its closing. It never really was that good." These people have been smoking a little too much bromine. It's not contradictory to admit that Splash Mountain was great while also saying that it should be removed due to changing cultural opinions. And even if you don't think that Splash is Disney's best ride like I do, to call it bad or boring is simply incorrect. At this point in the video, I want to make something very clear. Although we're about to start shitting on all of the chuds on Disney Twitter from the Save Splash Mountain crowd, I think it's important to show them some empathy. Yes, I get it's fun to make fun of Disney adults over a ride because caring about things on the internet is cringe, right? But for the non-theme park fans, you got to put yourself in their shoes. Think of every medium of art you can. Books, video games, cooking, music. The most high-profile, celebrated works from these mediums are going to be here until humanity's extinction. Yes, there are certain types of lost media that are sought after, but the absolute pinnacles of these art forms are something that you will always be able to experience. Even if it was deemed offensive, no one could ever destroy every copy of Citizen Kane. You will always have the opportunity to read To Kill a Mockingbird. Even food which has to be destroyed to be experienced can be recreated using the same methods and ingredients. That is not true for theme park rides. Theme park rides are physical structures that can be taken down and replaced at any time. While you could theoretically rebuild a theme park ride, this basically never happens because by the time a theme park goes through the effort of rebranding and designing a replacement ride, it almost never makes financial sense to go back and remake a previous ride that was dismantled for a reason to begin with. So if you're not a theme park fan, imagine your favorite comfort TV show. Imagine being told that you'll never be able to watch it ever again. You can maybe read summaries about it online, but getting that full experience of sitting down and viewing that thing is just gone forever. That TV show that was there for you when you were sick, or that movie that you identified with as a child, you can just simply never revisit ever again. We don't choose the things that we form an emotional attachment to, and I imagine that a lot of the same people that were laughing at theme park nerds for Splash Mountain being destroyed are the same people who threw a bitch fit whenever The Office left Netflix. Now, with that out of the way, it's also important to understand that your feelings about Splash Mountain being taken away do not justify those feelings manifesting into MAGA red pill frustrations and complaining about the woke culture war. I think a big part of why the Splash Mountain debate is so fascinating to me is that it really mirrors real life politics, but in a very serious and inconsequential way. A lot of conservatives are just lashing out because their life sucks and they don't understand why. And when a charismatic asset comes along and tells them it's about these other people that are different than you, a lot of them gravitate towards that. They're able to blame these people that they don't believe fully exist because they aren't in their lives, and they finally have a scapegoat to blame for all of their problems. And this is just one way that you can completely radicalize a battleground state that has nothing to do with Disney, like, I don't know, Florida, and turn it into a MAGA haven. Now, as for how Florida became such a red state in the first place, I highly recommend this Vox video that I'm going to link in the description. But essentially, since George Bush's narrow victory in Florida in 2000, the Florida Republican Party has been steadily growing in size and funding. This came to a head in 2020 when the state was viewed as a haven from the COVID lockdowns that were happening across a majority of the developed country. Florida saw a huge influx of new residents during that time, most of which were conservative, and before you know it, Florida transformed from a solid swing state into a fortified MAGA bastion. Former presidential candidate and governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, is a significant figure in this neoconservative movement and has only helped solidify Florida's red state status. And this is where Disney enters the picture. The most emblematic piece of legislation from his administration is the Parental Rights and Education Bill, or what critics call the Don't Say Gay bill. Essentially, it was a bill that made it illegal for teachers to openly discuss LGBT topics to students in certain grades. In the guise of giving parents more rights, this bill prevents teachers from even acknowledging that queer people exist, which opens up a whole can of worms. If a teacher is L, G, B, or T, they can be targeted just for discussing their spouse. A teacher could also lose their job if they don't snitch on a student who confides in them that they might be gay. Disney, who's a major employer in the state of Florida, had a lot of employees who wanted them to take a stand against such horrible legislation. And so, then CEO Bob Chapek took the staunchest stance he possibly could at the time, to not say anything until the day after it passed when it was already too late. Which, this is just such a Disney response, because keep in mind, this is the same company who will hype up a gay kiss in one of their movies throughout its entire press junket, just for it to be a blink and you miss it moment that can easily be edited out of the movie for less progressive foreign markets. They will never take an actual stand that has any kind of long-lasting negative implications because they don't actually care about this shit. But I digress. This milquetoast opposition drew the ire of Ron DeSantis, and he launched his ego-driven Disney war against the company, which started threatening the decades-long symbiotic relationship between Disney and the Florida government. In the same way that Disneyland created a booming economy in Anaheim, transforming the area from a bunch of orange groves into a destination theme park, Disney World did the same thing for Central Florida. The land that Disney World was built on was just worthless, undeveloped swampland. So in exchange for bringing money and prominence to Central Florida, Disney was given something called the Reedy Creek Improvement District, essentially a governing body that allows them to cut through a lot of red tape that they would normally have to deal with the Florida government. Disney World essentially operates as its own city, and it makes things like construction way easier than in its sister park in Anaheim, where they're constantly having to deal with zoning restrictions and the local government. Conversely, since Disney controls its own utilities, it does not drain resources away from other parts of the region either. So again, overall, this relationship is a win-win for both Florida and Disney. But DeSantis saw this unique governing situation as a carrot that he could dangle in front of Disney to make them fall in line. DeSantis tried to convince people that the Reedy Creek Improvement District was some kind of drain on the local government, even though any reasonable person could just see that DeSantis was trying to bully them. DeSantis also threatened to raise taxes for Disney, jack up their utility rates, set up toll roads on the way to Disney, and he even said he was going to put a prison next to Walt Disney World, which admittedly would have been very funny. He also pursued the narrative that Disney was trying to infect the minds of young people with their gay woke agenda, and it's just another way to try to control the type of movies that they were putting out. Disney rightfully filed suit claiming that DeSantis was violating their First Amendment right as a company to free speech, which he was. Eventually, in March of 2024, both parties settled and the case was dropped. An independent investigation eventually found that there was no criminal wrongdoing on the part of the Reedy Creek Improvement District, just further solidifying the fact that this entire charade was just a complete farce. It didn't help DeSantis' political aspirations either, since he dropped out of the 2024 presidential race, and I don't think messing with Disney won him any favors. While I'm sure it was a popular Republican opinion to stand up to woke Disney, I think when a lot of these conservatives realized that what DeSantis was proposing was going to significantly hamper their experience going to the parks, I think they stopped openly supporting him. Because leave it to conservatives to stop actually caring about anything as soon as it starts affecting them materially. But in the midst of all this petty back and forth, something actually tragic happened. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. It was the most clear-cut case of police brutality ever captured on camera, and it caused Americans to re-examine race and systemic racism in America in a way that I can't remember ever before in my lifetime. One such realization was that an American institution like Disney probably shouldn't have a ride based on a movie which debatably glorified slavery. An online petition circulated shortly after Floyd's murder to change Splash Mountain to Princess and the Frog, a movie ostensibly about black representation. It garnered over 20,000 signatures. And finally, we return to the beginning of this video. About a month later, Disney announced that it would be retheming Splash Mountain. In classic Disney fashion, they denied that this change had anything to do with the petition or any of the protests relating to the George Floyd murder, but Disney has a rich history of caving to public pressure and then denying that their changes had anything to do with said pressure. Now, it's possible that this retheme was at least in conversation for years ahead of time, because Disney has all kinds of potential outs for all kinds of rides that are on the chopping block of what they might be themed into, etc. But given the relatively long turnaround time between this announcement and when construction actually started on Splash Mountain and Magic Kingdom, it's not out of the question that this decision was made completely in panic mode. Now, the version of the ride that we see in this concept art ended up being pretty different from the version that we ultimately got. But, Disney fans didn't overreact to that change, right? Everyone was very normal and rational throughout the ride's announcement and construction, right? A big question that I wanted to answer in this video about Tiana's detractors is just, who are these people? Who are these people who just vehemently cling to the past of Splash Mountain or any other piece of anti-woke media that eventually gets replaced? Are they all angry white MAGA men? What do these people have in common? The answer may surprise you. So what I did for this process is I saved the Twitter accounts of everybody that I saw on my feed complaining about Splash Mountain's closure. And as a result of engaging with this conservative-oriented discourse, my Twitter feed has been permanently corrupted by the dumbest people on the internet. You're welcome, by the way. So after I gathered all of these people, I combed through their Twitter feeds and saw what type of person they were, as well as just what they were saying about Splash and Tiana's. My first observation was this anti-Splash crowd is actually a lot more diverse than I originally thought. While an overwhelming amount of them were white, politically conservative people, there were a good amount that were politically neutral, gay, and a lot that were neurodivergent. Now, while I understand that diagnosing someone over their Twitter feed is generally not really cool, I also saw enough tweets about stimming as well as strong emotional attachment to certain things and niche, deep understanding of things about Splash Mountain and Disney lore and history that I'm pretty confident in saying a lot of these people are on the autism spectrum. And part of their frustration, I can imagine, comes from being on the spectrum, having your comfort thing taken away from you, and then being told by everyone online that you are a bad person for liking it. I would go as far as to say that this is a major source of conflict between the pro-Tiana and the pro-Splash people, and it actually came to a head on the night of the Magic Kingdom version of Splash's closure. On the last night of Splash's operation in Florida, tons of people came out to both celebrate as well as mourn the attraction, but others came to smugly gloat about people losing their favorite ride. The line stretched for hours and eventually had to be cut off before the park closed. A lot of guests attempted to time when they got in line so they would be the last guests to get to ride Splash Mountain. Well, one family who loved Splash Mountain misplayed this strategy severely and the line was cut off before they can get in it. They argued with staff, and the daughter, who I believe was a fully grown adult, began to have a meltdown in public that she couldn't say goodbye to her favorite attraction. One member of Disney Twitter, who is definitely on the left-leaning side of politics, came to document and film all of the sad boys in line for Splash Mountain and took the opportunity to film this public freakout and post it online. Eventually, it was pointed out that that girl is on the autism spectrum, and the original poster apologized, pulled the video offline, and recognized his lapse in judgment, and I believe has been private ever since. Now, did that person that posted the video have any way of knowing that that girl was on the autism spectrum? No, but a little empathy goes a long way. Smugly gloating and utter sadness is generally a dick move, and if someone is having such a strong public display of emotion, it's usually because there's some type of mental health component where the person is not processing things as a typical person should. And while I have never been professionally diagnosed with autism, I can imagine being on the spectrum and having your favorite thing taken away from you and being told that it's evil and you're evil for liking it would be very distressing. But on the other side of the coin, that distress does not excuse shitty, toxic behavior. And it's very hard for these people to square the circle of how they feel in their hearts with reality, so they do all kinds of crazy mental gymnastics to justify how they feel and why it's more racist the Splash was taken away and replaced by Tiana's. For example, a recent development was when it was pointed out that an image of James Baskett from Song of the South still remained in the Hollywood Studios attraction One Man's Dream. Disney apparently saw this tweet and then it was promptly removed unceremoniously. I guess not even Disney executives go in that attraction. And the reaction, as you could imagine from the Splashers, was something like, removing a picture of a black man? Who's the racist one now? Essentially suggesting that being race conscious is racist because being completely ignorant to race beyond a surface level is what's actually truly tolerant, apparently. These are all just obvious copes that get used by everybody on the pro Splash side, and again, I imagine you're a lot more likely to employ this if you're trying to justify reality with why you're so upset about your comfort thing being taken away. Although the Splash crowd may have been more diverse than I originally thought, it by no means gives them a pass to be ignorant. Which brings me to my next point. While there are a lot of people who defend Splash who are relatively innocent people, there are also a lot of them that are truly horrible. And what's frustrating is these innocent Splash people do exist, but they also channel these absolute pieces of shit in their replies and either don't notice them or don't care to correct them. And there are a number of people in this community who I just want to take a second to examine what they have to say. Exhibit A. This splasher, who dedicates his life to tweeting about how a theme park ride is gone, thinks women shouldn't have the right to vote because they're too emotional. But again, him spending his energy complaining about a Disney ride for little kids, not emotional at all. He also thinks that gay days should be abolished at Disney, which was a belief that I unfortunately saw in a lot of pro-Splash people, in that on January 6th, Republicans let Democrats off with a warning, and they really could have taken over the Capitol if they really wanted to. Which, the irony of that tweet just astounded me, because it's like these people are simultaneously these huge, tough macho rebels who are willing to dismantle the government at the drop of a hat, but they also just love Disney. Exhibit B is a pretty prominent figure on right-wing Disney Twitter, which is a thing that exists, unfortunately. Now, while this guy, he's not necessarily racist or homophobic in the same way some of these other people are, he's just constantly tweeting about the good old days of the company and how culturally we need to shift back into how things used to be at the parks. The good old days, which, you know, is just a dog whistle. He said that Disney should revert back to the 1960s grooming standards where cast members couldn't show tattoos or have facial hair. He also spreads whatever flavor of the month conspiracy theory is going on right-wing Twitter, like that the only reason that Kamala Harris beat Trump in the presidential debate was because woke ABC gave her the questions ahead of time. He also believes that Trump shouldn't be prosecuted for any of his crimes just because he's president. In general, just a lot of dog whistles and very regressive, and just believing that anything that used to be at the parks is better because it's old, therefore it must be good. Exhibit C is similar to Exhibit B in that he's just generally regressive when it comes to changes at the park, but he's particularly anti-mask and actually went viral on Disney Twitter early this year. Disney tweeted a video of a Tiana's Bayou Adventure character designer who just so happened to be wearing a mask. And his very reasonable response to this video was, "Why is this wearing a mask?" This tweet spread pretty quickly, at least by Disney Twitter standards, and basically everyone was giving him shit, even pro-Splash people, but he just continued to double down. And what I find so funny about this person is just by going through your feed, you get the impression that he's very much a fuck your feelings type guy who just gets off on triggering the libs. But in going through his Twitter feed, I also found a picture that he posted of his bedroom, which looks like it belongs to a 5-year-old. Now, normally I wouldn't be so quick to judge someone's hobbies. I mean, I realize that someone could look at my interest in Disney, manga, or video games and call that infantile. However, at least I'm not a 40-year-old man who tweets like a tough guy from his single mattress race car bed. My final and most important observation about all these splashers is that just by looking at their Twitter feeds, you can tell that these people are almost universally miserable. One of the main challenges for my research is that these people tweet a lot. For a lot of accounts, I was scrolling for like 45 minutes and was still seeing tweets from less than a month ago. And most of these tweets were just all negativity. Negativity about Disney, about Splash Mountain, about woke. And you see this everywhere on the internet where there's a lot of communities, mostly conservative, that are just in a perpetual state of outrage about things that really don't matter that much, like entertainment. While it's certainly possible to care about multiple things at once, there's a certain amount of privilege that's necessary in order for a black person in a Marvel movie trailer to ruin your day. But there's a very good reason why these people are constantly negative. It's online right-wing grifters who have a vested financial interest in keeping these people as angry and divided as humanly possible. Which takes me to the final subject of my Twitter analysis. So far, I've kept the identities of the people that I'm talking about private because while they do have shitty ideas as well as public Twitter profiles, they have relatively low amounts of followers and they're not causing significant harm. But these people in the Disney community, I specifically want to mention by name because they are just spreading perpetual negativity and division for financial gain. If you spent any amount of time on social media, you've almost definitely seen some variant of these right-wing grifters, and their MO in whatever space they occupy is basically the same. Their sole intent is to rile people up in an attempt to get more views and sow disdain for people that are not like them. The leader in this right-wing Disney space is a site called That Park Place. It's a site with multiple contributors, many of which go by aliases or hide behind avatars, including WDW Pro and Jonas J. Campbell. What's so ironic is that their motto is, "For all the things that should be fun." I don't understand how you can make that your channel's motto with zero self-reflection about how your website is just filled with constant hate and negativity. If you're ever looking to just feel bad for no particular reason, just take a casual scroll through their homepage at all their articles. Park Place is just filled to the brim with articles complaining about diversity, a minority was cast in this thing, there's more than one black person in this video game, etc. Accounts like That Park Place and its affiliates have a vested interest in keeping their audience angry, and they're willing to bend reality whatever way they need to fit their narrative to make that happen. These grifters have crafted this really useful logic loop where the motto, "Go woke, go broke," is just a universal truth that can never be wrong. See, whenever a project that's deemed woke fails, like Star Wars Outlaws, The Acolyte, Concord, they tap dance on its grave for 4 weeks minimum. What happens when one of these woke movies becomes the highest grossing animated film of all time? Well, that's just because it wasn't that woke, and that's the only reason it made so much money. Take a look at this tweet about Inside Out 2. It's an average Pixar film without much woke in it. Just don't inject modern messaging and you'll make $1 billion, Disney. This tweet is just so detached from reality, I don't even know where to begin. First of all, the movie is about a girl named Riley whose lib family moves to Cuck, San Francisco. She plays hockey, which, yeah, totally realistic for girls to be playing such a violent sport. One of the varsity players wears a hijab on the ice, which that alone should have limited the movie to a 3 out of 10 score at best. One of the new emotions in this movie is anxiety, which we know is a fake mental illness millennials use as an excuse to get out of talking to people they don't know. And Riley has a heavily implied lesbian crush, which is central to the movie. This movie is as woke, if not more woke, than any other movie that Disney's put out recently. But because it made a ton of money, that's because the movie's not too bad, so it still conveniently fits within their framework of reality. And while it was reported that the wokeness in Inside Out 2 was supposedly toned down, there was still so much in the final movie that culture warriors bitch about that I have no doubt that if Inside Out 2 had failed, they would point to these things as the reason for its failure. So what did That Park Place think of Wicked? Well, Alphaba was cast as a black woman, so that's gotta be woke. So the movie must have been a disaster because, you know, go woke, go broke, right? Oh, it was immensely successful. Wait, how could that be? I don't understand. Okay, so now it was the marketing that was woke, not the actual movie. Okay, I got it. That's not even mentioning how other movie franchises like Star Wars or Marvel are some of the most successful of the past decade and are full of woke, but again, it doesn't fit within the go woke, go broke narrative, so they just throw these out. So to demonstrate how unserious That Park Place is as a news organization, as well as just to look at how these right-wing culture outrage farms work and manipulate their readers, I like to analyze one of that Park Place's articles. And calling these posts articles is really generous because they're more like glorified blog posts than anything else. But since that Park Place views themselves as a reputable news organization, let's just call these articles. Now here's a random article that I found in my research for Splash Mountain. Media blames the failure of Tiana's Bayou adventure on Christians? Now before we even get to the body of the article, this headline is just so expertly crafted to get people to rage click because it perpetuates the white Christian victim complex as well as giving people something to direct their hate and anger at, which is Tiana's Bayou adventure. Now, first of all, this article is written by someone named M. Montanero, who identifies as the editor-in-chief of that Park Place. And it's not just that Park Place because according to his bio, he's also worked at various news organizations as editor-in-chief as well. Wow, editor-in-chief. Are we talking like Wall Street Journal? Are we talking New York Times? I mean, this guy's a regular media mogul. Well, if you Google that name, you'll find nothing. So either he's using an alias or he's just being very liberal with the title editor-in-chief. Now, if it is an alias and you are working in media, why aren't you proud of the work that you're putting out online? Would you be embarrassed if your professional career was called into question because people found out that you were secretly a hate merchant? I went to his channel, Tooneytown, and while the branding makes it seem like a channel targeted at kids, it's just more of the same endless complaining about the culture war. I did not spend very much time researching him on there because frankly I have better things to do, but it doesn't seem like he shows his face on there either. So assuming that he is a editor-in-chief in the professional sense, he clearly does not want the association between whatever he's posting incognito and his real life. Now, the other option, which I think is far more likely, is that in an attempt to make it big, he started just numerous WordPress blogs, and for each new WordPress site he created, that's another credit as editor-in-chief. Just like me owning this YouTube channel with less than 100 subscribers makes me the head of a multimedia company, apparently. But anyways, let's look at the article. With Tiana's Bayou adventure failing to delight the majority of Disney fans, no, it's not, many have been left wondering what went wrong. Why is this ride, a replacement for one of the most beloved rides of all time in Splash Mountain, such a letdown for so many? Well, the Hill's Mark Pinsky thinks he knows the answer. Is it the fact the attraction doesn't work? Is it the racist undertones in the happy-go-lucky depiction of the Avery Island salt mines and its history of abuse and slave labor? Is it the lackluster music or the fact that an attraction teeming with more than 70 animatronic critters has been turned into experience with less than 50 animatronics? Nope. It's Christians, specifically white Christians. Yeah, I'm sure that's exactly what the article says too. In his article titled Tiana's Bayou Adventure, the Racial and Religious Politics of Disney's New Theme Park Ride, Pinsky praises Disney's decision to replace Splash Mountain, an attraction based on a film that he, a very, very white man, claims is deeply offensive to many African Americans. So Mr. M. Montanero is implying here that because there are some black people who don't have an issue with Song of the South and don't think it's racist, that is actually the true opinion, that any white people who point out all of the well-documented issues that people have had with Song of the South, that they are truly the racist ones because they're presuming to speak for black people, even though that's exactly what M. Montanero is doing right now. Pinsky then takes a break from virtue signaling to get to his actual point. Very funny. Discussion of the ride's new incarnation has so far justly focused on the dramatic racial symbolism for Disney theme parks, he said, getting a little more virtue signaling in there for good measure. The point the Hill article makes is that Dr. Facilier is missing from Tiana's Bayou Adventure, likely due to Disney not wanting to offend Christians by depicting voodoo in their ride. And that Park Place disagrees, since offending Christians is something that has supposedly never stopped them from doing things in the past. Now, this is kind of an interesting suggestion. I never really considered it. I don't think that the removal of voodoo, which does seem like a clear choice by Disney, has anything to do with Christians. So I will actually have to unfortunately agree with my man M. Montanero here. Disney over the years has been gradually distancing themselves from any sort of outright religious depictions from religions that are still practiced today. So that's why you'll see any sort of mug from like Trader Sam's doesn't have a traditional tiki design. It's always based on some Disney character. I'd call it less woke and just more risk averse. So again, M. Montanero doesn't agree with this assertion because Disney has never shied away from offending white Christians in the past. So what evidence does he cite? Recently, Disney made headlines for allowing biological men with beards to wear dresses and makeup while working in the Bibbidi Bobbidi Boutique, where young girls receive princess makeovers. That Park Place also broke a story earlier this year regarding a biological male playing the role of the evil queen from Snow White at a Walt Disney World restaurant. The company also goes above and beyond to acknowledge LGBT Pride Month, ew, throughout June got embroiled in a messy and costly legal battle with the state of Florida over opposition to the Parental Rights and Education Bill. That legal issue will reportedly cost the company more than $1 trillion over the next century. Now, I'm not going to pretend like Disney made the decision to stand up to that bill to be on the right side of history, but if there is one political party who would not be able to comprehend the thought of standing up against something just because it's the right thing to do no matter how much it costs them, it's going to be your political party, Mr. Montanaro. Now, this is my favorite part of the whole article. It's not the intention of this reporter to pass judgment on the company for its actions in this news article. Rather, we're merely pointing out that one would logically look at this and surmise that these aren't the actions of a company concerned with offending the sensibilities of conservative Christians. Now, what I love about this paragraph is it exposes how highly Ed Montanaro thinks of himself. Now, I'll give you a pass on calling yourself a reporter, because even though all you're doing here is just aggregating someone else's reporting, and even then not even reporting, just someone's opinion piece, who knows, maybe in the past you've broken a story or two. But to say that you're not intending to pass judgment, brother, look in the mirror. Virtually every sentence in this blog post that you call an article is editorialized. Best case, you are clueless when it comes to journalism and don't understand the basic differences between an objective news piece and an opinion piece. Worst case, which I think is far more likely, is that you are knowingly trying to Trojan horse your opinion into these news articles in order to give people a false perception of objective reality. Your entire site is based on warping news coverage to fit within a right-wing culture war framework and justifying people's prejudices. And then for good measure, they add this picture of Hades, who is voiced by James Woods, a notorious MAGA asshat who's been blacklisted from Hollywood for being such an asshole. Call me conspiratorial, but it feels like a deliberate choice that they caption this as James Woods as Hades. This is obviously not a picture of James Woods, so there's no logical reason why you would need to tell people that his voice is what comes out of Hades' mouth. So I feel like this was a deliberate choice, unless M. Montanaro, Mr. Editor-in-Chief Extraordinaire, has no concept of AP style or any type of syntax, but, you know, that's probably also just as likely. Now, am I going excessively hard on M. Montanaro and his reputable news organization? Yes, I am. Normally, I would support an independent news team that's just growing and trying to do their own thing. Even if you or any of the people working for you have zero professional journalism experience, I think that's okay, and you should be able to post, grow, make mistakes, because that's part of learning, and independent journalism is important. But as I said, you and the entirety of Park Place are just hate merchants who have no issue distorting the truth if it means riling people up and getting more clicks. Every single piece of content that your site has put out about Tiana's Bayou Adventure has been posted from the perspective of, this thing is going to suck, here's why you should hate it. Because it replaced Splash Mountain, so it's the politically convenient position for you to have. Every leak that you uncovered during Tiana's construction was done solely in the interest of furthering the narrative that Tiana's was going to be a shit show. That's not what objective reporting is. As much as conservatives love to cry about the gay agenda, the woke agenda, you are what a news organization with an agenda actually looks like. Every writer on your staff either has no idea how to write a news story objectively, or they know that if they were truly objective, then you guys wouldn't grow at all. And I mean, you guys are just so lucky that this woke shit exists, because if it didn't, you would not survive in the online media landscape. It is so insanely easy to be a right-wing grifter online, and there is way more money to be made in pumping out culture war slop than there is in creating interesting and substantive content. Now, why is that, you may ask? How do I know that for a fact? There's a very good reason. While I was writing this video, there was a significant development in the online right-wing media space. It was revealed that multiple major conservative media personalities were getting their funding from a pretty peculiar place. One of the most high-profile commentators was Tim Pool, who was being paid $100,000 a week by his parent company, Tenet Media, who it was discovered had ties to Russia. Essentially, there's reasonable suspicion that Tim Pool was either knowingly or unknowingly being fed programming intended to disrupt American society. While Tim claims that Tenet Media had no influence on programming and that he had no knowledge of their ties to Russia, he's either criminally liable or criminally stupid. And just eyeballing Tim's recent videos, the majority of them get 50,000 views or less. While I'm sure he has other revenue streams and platforms, anybody that's innocent would wonder why someone would pay them almost $500,000 a month for that level of engagement.
But when you look at the trajectories of some of these individuals and you see the rapid, in some cases, subscriber growth that took place without necessarily a lot of views, sort of a disproportionate amount of public notoriety that didn't seem matched by the actual interest in the content, because a lot of people aren't necessarily interested in what these individuals are saying, you start to wonder, is there some artificial mechanism that is signal boosting the content?
And when you look at how many of Tim Pool's videos are about how the United States is on the brink of an impending civil war, it's easy to understand why Russia would have an interest in sowing a conservative culture war to make sure that Americans are in a perpetual state of negativity.
Ukraine is the enemy of this country. Ukraine is our enemy, being funded by the Democrats. I will stress this again. One of the greatest enemies of our nation right now is Ukraine.
Now, wouldn't it be crazy if we could show that the goals of the Russia-funded Tim Pool podcast, as well as that park place, were somehow aligned?
He's been cited by IGN, The Quartering, Timcast, The Daily Wire, Bounding Into Comics, and even Dr. Jordan B. Peterson.
Disney insider WDW Pro recently speculated on...
Now, WDW Pro did unlist this trailer after the Tim Pool news broke, and I'm certainly not saying that they have ties to Russia or that Putin would somehow want to control the narrative on online theme park discourse. But what I am saying is that the countries that do hate America have an interest in our society being as divided and regressive as possible, and channels like this profit from that agenda. And when you look at the negative impact that these conservative online accounts have, you have to ask yourself which political party is truly pro-America. I'm sure that these three dudes on this podcast would say that it's them, since they peddle election conspiracy theories and propagate whatever MAGA flavor of the month is getting the most traction online. Just understand that your goals as a content creator align with their enemies overseas, and you are doing their bidding whether you realize it or not, which based on the video you privated, you probably do. And for the record, there's no huge big conspiracy with that park place. They're just MAGA shitbags who make people perpetually angry for money, which just so happens to play into the hands of the countries who are plotting for the destruction of the United States. So let's switch gears and talk about Tiana's construction. From the moment Tiana's was announced, it had an uphill battle. To no one's surprise, Tiana's faced an overwhelming amount of negativity at every single piece of news that trickled in, from its creation to its completion. And I'm going to do my best to summarize what I remember from each phase of its construction, because it's surprisingly difficult to sort through the dozens of construction updates about the ride, as well as track all the outrages at the tiniest leaks of information that came out, but I'm going to try. When Tiana's Bayou adventure was initially announced in 2020, it was accompanied by this concept art and a plot description that would eventually heavily differ from the final product. The original plot was Tiana and Lewis were preparing for their first Mardi Gras performance, and the guests would, I guess, witness that. In my opinion, this was a really bad ride concept, so I'm glad they moved off of that. But the most infamous aspect of this concept art is Mama Odie's boat at the top of the mountain, and we'll get back to that. Overall, it was a dramatic reimagining of the existing Splash Mountain structure that seemed a little bit too good to be true at the time, because it was. In August 2021, Disney released new concept art of an interior scene of the ride. Here you can see the critters that would eventually be added in silhouette. The most significant deviation from the final ride here is that Prince Naveen is taking an active role in the story, and he, Tiana, and Lewis are hosting a Mardi Gras celebration. Overall, not that different than the final version of the ride. Approximately a year later, in September of 2022 at Disney's fan convention D23, Imagineering displayed an updated model for Tiana's Bayou adventure. Notably, the boat which crowned the mountain was more or less replaced with this Tiana's Foods water tower. Now, it's not uncommon for ride concepts to be scaled down as the realities of budgets and feasibility begin to close in, but for a ride that had so much hype behind it and just had to succeed, this was a little disappointing to see. In December 2022, Disney released another piece of indoor Splash Mountain concept art, and this one was more or less final for what the ride would ultimately become. On February 3rd, 2023, Disney shared some details about the story for the ride, and it did not sound good. Tiana wants to give a big thanks to her family and friends and the entire community for all the support they've given her by throwing an amazing party during Mardi Gras season. Food from the party is being prepared and beignets are being loaded into crates for the celebration. All kinds of preparations are underway for the journey into the Bayou with Tiana, along with new and familiar friends from the animated film. Picking up where the story left off, Tiana continues bringing people together with Tiana's Foods, another treasured meeting place to spend time together and celebrate a diverse community. The endeavor began when Tiana purchased the salt mine and the area surrounding the large salt dome it operated from. This multifaceted enterprise has turned the aging salt mine into a space that has come alive. Complete with a boutique farm and both a working and teaching kitchen, Tiana's Foods is where Tiana and her colleagues create all sorts of new products that they are bringing to the world, including a line of original hot sauces. There were a lot of unnecessary multisyllabic words and not a really strong plot or conflict. Although unfortunately, as we'll see later in the video, this ended up being pretty close to the final version of the ride. Some people even said that it sounded like AI because it was written pretty loosely and didn't really make a lot of sense, and I kind of agree with that. And speaking of AI, as opening day was drawing closer in May of 2023, it came out that Disney was probably using bots to boost positive engagement of Tiana's Bayou adventure, which at first I was skeptical of this claim because it does sound like something a right-wing grifter would come up with, but the more I looked into it, it seemed like it was probably true. This stemmed from a tweet from Drew Disney Dude, who is a young and rising Disney news account who heavily documented Tiana's construction. He made this tweet about the nighttime lighting for the ride. People found that his mentions were filled with a bunch of replies that didn't make any sense and seemed like they were written by AI. And the only two parties who would have an interest in doing this would be Drew Disney Dude to boost engagement on his posts and Disney themselves. Now, from what I've seen, Drew Disney Dude seems like a genuine guy, and it seems pretty out of character for him to buy bots just to boost his engagement. So I think it's pretty likely to assume that this was done by Disney, so not a great look. And seeing as Disney is now looking to expand their usage of AI for their business needs, as well as its artwork and the theme parks apparently, it's all the more reason to believe it was used here. Next, in July of 2023, came some pretty damning comments from Tony Baxter, who's one of the most highly regarded Imagineers in history. Tony Baxter, who you might remember from earlier in this video, was the leading creative force on Splash Mountain.
I love the revisionist stuff now because I remember Michael Eisner said, well, let's put it out again to see if there's still interest in this movie that's from the 40s. And I think in that last reissue in theaters, it did better than it did when it came out. It was like very, very successful. So none of that controversy really existed. We thought we were on good footing, and we certainly wouldn't want it. There was nothing in the ride. I will stand by this even today. There was not one thing in the ride that in any way was detrimental to anybody. Whatever the controversy is come up with, it's more related to what the film is, and I think we're way overboard on that kind of sensitivity.
Naturally, splashers jumped at this comment as it was all of their beliefs being validated by a legendary Imagineer. One event that I cannot date that just showed just how desperate people were to shit on this ride is something that I'd like to call Gate. As you can see here, there's what looks like a gate in the front of the ride, and I remember just dozens of people that were fully convinced that this gate would be present in the final version of the ride, and it was something worth getting upset over. Mind you, when people were freaking out, the ride still looked like this, so in the minds of those people, this was basically the finished product. Believe it or not, this was not the finished product, and they did end up covering that gate, so basically a bunch of whining for nothing. Now, it's hard enough to contend with the army of online trolls that Tiana's was constantly embattled with, but soon, Tiana's biggest hater would emerge, and his name was Bob Iger.
In an exclusive, this is from a high-level source, believe it or don't, Disney CEO Bob Iger, he recently visited this attraction to preview it, to see what they've done with the insights so far, and to ride the ride. And Iger, whose predecessor Chapek is the one that I think Iger pins a lot of the errors with this project on, allegedly said as he finished walking it, quote, "This is really boring."
Now, do I appreciate that Iger was willing to be critical and push for excellence on this ride? Yes. Do the milquetoast story treatments that we were given lead me to believe that this account was true? Also yes. While it's unclear what changes were implemented after this comment, or even if the comment was made at all, it just added more negativity to a project that really did not need it. Now, with all of the negativity surrounding Tiana's, Disney was about to do something that shut up even the most toxic haters. On April 4th, 2024, Disney released a very revealing video of some of the animatronics of the ride, and even the biggest Tiana's haters could not deny that these figures were insanely impressive. It was revealed that we'd be getting 48 animatronics on this ride of varying degrees of functionality. The Tiana figure would be the same model as Hong Kong Disneyland's Frozen ride figures, meaning none of the controversial rear projection faces that Disney had championed over the past decade. The Lewis figures were also a highlight since he has this really impressive bounce as he's conducting. It's especially impressive considering he's such a unique looking figure, so unlike something humanoid, There's no template to base his movements off of. But undoubtedly the most impressive figure was Grandma Odie. Like Lewis, she's not shaped like a normal human, but Imagineering still brought her to life perfectly, and she somehow maintained the same fluidity as in the Princess and the Frog movie. One of the final developments before the ride opened was that Disney released an official ride POV of Tiana's Bayou adventure, which at the time blew my mind on so many levels. First off, it's completely unprecedented for Disney to post their own ride POVs. Ride-throughs of theme park attractions are like a sub genre on YouTube that Disney has never really engaged with, let alone released their own POV of a ride that's not even opened yet. I have to think that this was some kind of play to combat all the negativity in a way that I really do not understand. The reaction when the ride-through was posted was negative, of course. I deliberately went out of my way to avoid spoilers and not watch it at the time, but even pro-Splash people were saying how bad the POV was and how it was a poor way for people to first experience the attraction. And as a certified ride-through POV watcher expert, I genuinely have no idea what these people were talking about. After I rode the ride myself, I went back and watched this footage, and unless they updated the video and this is a different version than what people initially saw, I don't know what these people are talking about. This ride-through is pretty much perfect. There are a few points where the camera doesn't pan over to a scene, and Disney did make the decision to crossfade through some of the space in between major scenes. But other than that, the exposure in this footage is perfect. You will never get a clearer picture of a dark ride. The audio is clean, and the camera is stable. To act like this ride-through was detrimental to the ride's reputation is just insane. So apart from just Disney weirdly spoiling people on an attraction before it opened, I do not understand what was so bad about this ride-through. If there was anything bad about it, I guess it just gave people another outlet to congregate and leave hundreds of hate comments about the ride. So I guess in that sense, it was a bad move. Even more bad news came as ride previews began. Throughout cast member and pass holder previews, the ride experienced constant breakdowns, and this time the trolls were not overreacting. And even people who were overwhelmingly positive about Tiana's throughout its construction were critical of these issues. So why did Tiana's keep breaking down when Splash was operating fine before? Now, I'm no engineer, but supposedly it has to do in part with the sensors used for the ride's animatronics. In the past, AAs would run constantly, meaning there would be unnecessary wear and tear when figures were moving without anyone to see them. The solution for Tiana's was for the figures to run on sensors, so when no one was around, they wouldn't be needlessly running, and this should have decreased downtime and repair costs. But something about Florida's Splash construction meant that sunlight was leaking in from outside the building and messing with the sensors, which caused them to break down all the time. Additionally, unlike Splash figures, which were pneumatic, these advanced Tiana's figures are electric, and electric figures are extremely sensitive to damp, humid environments. To a layman like me, this seems like more of a logical problem than just sunlight hitting some sensors, but I assume Imagineers had to have thought about this before making the decision to go with these types of figures, so who knows. At this point, the issues seem to be somewhat fixed in Florida, although I still encountered significant downtime on my trip to ride Tiana's. Disney said that they took extra time to resolve this for the Disneyland version, and it's apparently why this version was delayed there. Then finally, on June 28th, 2024, Tiana's Bayou Adventure officially opened in Magic Kingdom. And what do you know? People that wanted to like it, loved it, and people that wanted to hate it, really hated it. Some Disney fans who were critical said that Tiana's was actually pretty good, but the Splashers didn't take very kindly to this change in opinion. The right started brigading, and then any page that was somewhat critical of Disney in the past were called traitors for liking Tiana's. Remember, we're talking about theme park rides for little kids. For example, Poseidon Entertainment, who does generally apolitical theme park video essays, is typically critical of Disney and Universal in his videos. In the past, Poseidon Entertainment has admitted that this is because his negative videos are usually much more popular. While he does his best to be fair, that can be why he comes off as overly critical. But a lot of conservatives confused his criticalness with their criticalness, and when he didn't come out and hate Tiana's, he was deemed a pariah. People called him a sellout. They claimed he was censoring them for deleting their comments. It was just crazy. But then the opposite effect kind of started happening on the left. There was a movement in the other direction where anyone who was criticizing any aspect of Tiana's was just a racist right-wing troll. And while yes, there are a lot of terrible people who were dedicated to hating Tiana's no matter what, constant breakdowns as well as potentially barren, empty sets are legitimate complaints. The people on the right were dedicated to hating Tiana's, so they picked a team. But then the people on the left were dedicated to loving Tiana's, so they also picked a team. So at the end of the day, is the left really that much better than the right in this case? Now you could argue in this case that the left is at least nominally better for standing against racism, and I don't disagree with that. However, toxic positivity is still toxic, and in the long run, overly generalizing your opponent is not a winning strategy. And at the risk of sounding like a toothless centrist, in this case, both sides of this debate were annoying and unhelpful. So if you haven't written Tiana's yet and you want to know what it's like, look no further, because I will give you my complete and objectively 100% true opinion of both versions of the ride. On September 27th, 2024, I took a trip down to Orlando with riding Tiana's Bayou adventure being my main objective. I did everything that I could to avoid spoilers and preconceptions of the ride before I actually got on it, but there were a few things that I couldn't help but notice online that were kind of in the back of my mind when I was about to ride it. That the show scenes were mostly barren with an overuse of screens, and that the ride was notoriously unreliable and broke down all the time. So with those two things in mind, let's take you through my first time riding Tiana's Bayou adventure. I went to Magic Kingdom twice during my trip to Florida, and in total I was able to ride Tiana's 5 times. 4 times on the first day of my trip and once on the last day. So for those who don't know, I'll get into this later in the video, but Tiana's currently at the time of this recording still operates with a virtual queue, meaning that the only way you can ride it is if you have a boarding group, which you have to book before the park opens, or a lightning lane that you have to pay for. This is not something you can just wait in line for, so getting a boarding group early in the day is critical. So on my first day, I got a boarding group number. I think it was in like the 70s, as well as a lightning lane for around midday. But honestly, I was kind of nervous if I was even gonna get to ride, because Tiana's didn't even start boarding until like 12 p.m. As a result, the line got really backed up, and that virtual queue ended up being a whole lot less virtual. Overall, I probably ended up waiting about 30 minutes in the virtual queue line, which was annoying, but it gave me a lot of time to absorb the extended queue. And the environmental storytelling in the queue is very important to understanding the overall tone of Tiana's. There's not much that's going to add to the actual narrative itself, but there's a lot of little important subliminal details, which I'll get more into later after I go through the ride itself. The queue is very reminiscent of Splashes, and I guess rightfully so. It starts out with a dizzying crisscross of wood fencing before eventually leading you into what used to be the barn in Splash Mountain. You're treated to various jazz songs which set the New Orleans vibe, as well as a radio host who severely reminded me of Three Dog. It transports you well enough. I figured that the New Orleans vibe would work even more effectively in Disneyland being right next to New Orleans Square. It feels just a little bit out of place in Frontierland, but whatever, no big deal. I should probably at this point mention the final premise of the ride. Tiana and her friends are hosting a party, and you're invited. Most of the food is being brought by her company, Tiana's Foods, which is a worker-owned co-op. But you have to collect ingredients on your way to the party, and this is your role in the story. As you go through the queue, you see various news articles about Tiana starting her business, food production, and literature about how Tiana's company is a worker-owned co-op. More on that later. You pass through what I guess is some kind of spice mine. Instead of Splash, where you had a good open view of the loading platform, here it feels like an enclosed cave. You see various posters telling workers to watch out for each other and take care of yourself. Again, more on this later. Eventually you end up at the loading platform and board your log. For the first couple minutes, the ride is basically the same as Splash. You get a nice view of guests walking across the bridge over to Frontierland. They did a great job creating a swampy atmosphere for this first part, and I thought this scene was dressed very well. The lighting here is also beautiful at night, which in my opinion is the optimal way to experience the ride. Next we get our first big surprise, an animatronic character at the second lift hill. Tiana invites you to the big party and tells you that she needs help finding ingredients. Previously, this lift hill was just kind of a barren space with a bunch of farm equipment, so it was cool to see them turn this into an actual show scene. It's also rare to see an AA this advanced be outside of the main show building, so that was cool as well. At the top of the lift hill, we see various crops planted. We see Lewis foraging for food, as well as this armadillo giving us the stink eye. I also really like this scene. This scene in Splash Mountain had a lot of subtle information about what life was like on the mountain for the characters there, and this accomplishes the same thing in Tiana's. You then fall down the next lift hill and enter the first interior show scene, which is a nighttime bayou. Unlike Splash, where you were hit with a strong scent of bromine, there's a blast of cool air and you get this whiff of pine that really transports you to the bayou. This transition is even more effective if you're able to ride Tiana's at night, as the interior and exterior blend seamlessly. The first character you see inside is a huge Lewis animatronic, and this is where I started to see why the ride had so much downtime earlier in the day. Lewis was moving, but his mouth was not. Not the end of the world, but definitely takes you out of it a bit. You then see a bunch of the band critters in what is a very fun little scene. The purpose of these characters is basically solely because of Disneyland. See, the Critter Country land in Disneyland is in the back ass end of the park and always struggled attracting visitors all the way back there. Splash Mountain was that e-ticket attraction that took guests back there and turned that Critter Country into a viable land. Splash Mountain borders New Orleans Square, and with Princess and the Frog taking place in New Orleans, it kind of becomes an extension of that and leaves Critter Country with nothing. So getting rid of Splash and replacing it with a ride that also takes place in New Orleans would basically be leaving Critter Country with the B-ticket Winnie the Pooh ride and killing the land. The purpose of these critters is solely to tie the ride back into Critter Country, or Bayou Country as it's called now. This does come at the cost of the story getting a little muddled by them, because it's like, why are they there? But I don't think people care at all because they're cute, myself included. As for the scene itself, I have no issue with these characters being pretty basic. I think they have a good amount of life, and I don't think it's realistic to expect highly fluid animation for every character on the ride. I also love the song Gonna Take You There, or Going Down the Bayou, that you hear here. It's very catchy, and I dare say it's a worthy successor to How Do You Do. We also see another Tiana's AA. Not much to see here other than I think the screen in the background with the dancing fireflies is blended in nicely with the practical set pieces in the foreground. Next is a section that I guess people might be calling empty, but I think is effective at pacing the ride. You see these fireflies dancing in the trees above you and in the background screens. I don't think that guests need characters shoved in their face at every turn in order to be entertained, and it wouldn't feel like an adventure at all if you didn't have at least some moments of just chilling, vibing in the bayou without any characters interacting with you. I think that a lot of people forget too that Splash Mountain, especially later in its life, had a lot of scenes in just complete darkness, and in another like 10 seconds you get another scene full of animatronics. It's not like Navi River Journey where it's truly all just vibes and nothing happens. But anyway, in the next scene, Lewis is conducting a group of critters with Tiana. Just like the last scene, Lewis and Tiana are very fluid where the critters are simplistic. No issue here, but maybe it would have been a nice little tribute to bring back at least some of the inoffensive characters from Splash Mountain. Like this guy, what did he ever do? But I digress. Next we get some more vibes and another scene with Tiana and Lewis. Lewis is stuck face down, ass up in a log. I'm not sure if this is a tribute or out of convenience that this is the same part of the ride where Brer Bear gets stuck in the tree. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if this was the same exact Brer Bear animatronic that was just reskinned to save some money, but you know, given the placement on the ride, let's just call it a tribute. This scene starts the next section of the ride where Grandma Odie turns the log into a frog before you go falling into the next scene. Much like how the laugh in place was used here to change up the tone, this screen with Grandma Odie is used in the same way. I really like the transition here where there's a blast of cool air and this purple and yellow light that makes you squint and convey that a spell was just performed as you were falling. Here you see a bunch of oversized bottles and leaves to communicate the change in size, as well as giant frogs who are actually just normal sized frogs. You hear a rendition of Dig a Little Deeper, which pairs perfectly with the Gonna Take You There you heard earlier. You see more fireflies dancing to the music, which you can now see a lot clearer in frog size. There's one more drop here, which will probably slap you with water if you're in the front row, and you enter what used to be the splash scene with all the turtles and water features, and the FSU chipmunk. I do like how the water shoots over the log, giving a playful hint of danger that you might get wet before falling safely onto another rock. You see some more frogs playing instruments, as well as a giant Tiana and Lewis observing you in tiny frog form. I'm not gonna lie, something about this Tiana and Lewis just does not look right. I did like the perspective here of them being giant and us being tiny, but I don't know why that Disney, the world leader in 3D animation, put out something that looks like this on one of their premiere rides. This looks like a direct-to-DVD kids movie from 15 years ago. And I'm sure there's some kind of technical reason that I don't understand, but whatever. We get a better view of the fireflies dancing heading to the party. It is another screen, but there's virtually no way to do this practically. I really like this perspective gag with the bottle, which did a really good job of blending the digital and physical sets. It also helps prevent this scene from feeling like just another cheap screen. And finally, much like how in Splash you're distracted by the music and fun of the laugh in place, guests dancing to Dig a Little Deeper are eventually face to face with the drop they've been putting off this entire time. Instead of the two evil vultures, you have a video of Odie and Juju telling you how you have to be turned back to normal for the party. And yeah, this screen also looks pretty bad. But the practical effects on this lift hill more than make up for it. The royal purple and gold lighting on the mist conveys that magic is about to happen again. At the top of the lift hill, you see a full-size Mama Odie animatronic, which is one of the highlights of the ride given the cartoonish size and proportions. This is also another area why I discovered the ride did not open on time, because this Mama Odie was immobile for the entire day. One reason I like this scene is because of how much it's able to shake up the tone from the lift hill on Splash Mountain. I'm really fascinated by how just a change in story can completely change the thrill of a ride feature. I first experienced this whenever I rode Guardians of the Galaxy Mission Breakout for the first time, It transformed Tower of Terror, which is this really scary, foreboding drop ride, into something that was really fun and made you laugh. The ride itself was identical, but the story elements just completely changed the emotion that comes out of you. Then finally, we get to the big finale. The finale to Splash Mountain was a difficult thing to follow up with, and somehow this ride succeeded. I've seen even the biggest Splash haters admit that this finale is impressive, which is basically an impossible feat. You have this really upbeat, Mario Odyssey-esque song. You're overloaded with animatronics of other Princess and the Frog characters who didn't make the cut. It's overwhelming, but in the same way that the Zippity Doodah boat was. I also like that they maintain the same visual motif with the purple and gold lighting. Side note, I did think that it was odd that this scene is mostly obscured from the railroad. You can only view it through like partial frosted glass. I don't know if this was to retain an element of mystery for those who haven't gotten to ride the ride yet because it's so new, but I recall getting a pretty clear view of Splash's finale. And in what is essentially the ride's epilogue, you get up close with another ODAA with Juju and get another last whiff of those sweet beignets. Okay, so let's analyze this ride because there's actually a lot to talk about. The first thing I want to address is the music. I saw a lot of chatter online from Splash truthers that the music sucked and couldn't hold a candle to Splash's soundtrack. On all of my rides, I saw people humming, dancing to the songs. I saw people singing the songs throughout the park later in the day. These songs are objectively connecting with people more than Splash's songs did later in its life. And it could have to do with the fact that this ride is new, but I don't think it has that much to do with it. There's this nice continuity to all of the songs where a lot of them are from Princess and the Frog, but have this nice upbeat groove to it. Each song feels right at home from the last, and they're all tonally consistent. And I'm not even a big fan of Princess and the Frog, but I was still humming some of the songs after the first time I wrote it. Anyone arguing that the soundtrack is bad and that it's not connecting with guests is just way too far down the meme hole of their own Twitter feed. A+ on the music. The next thing I wanted to talk about is how much of the stuff that I loved about Splash Mountain was still there. Since Splash was my favorite ride, whenever I heard it was going to be replaced, I was very sad that I wouldn't be able to experience it ever again. But eventually I took comfort in the fact that while the story might be changing, a lot of the stuff that I loved would still be there, and I was 100% right about that. Little warnings about the big drop on the ride are still there, including the little teases about the track layout. The story beats are similar, like the tone change from when you get turned into a frog, or that excitement when you first enter the show building. That's all still there. And is there stuff that's not so great? Sure, but a lot of the stuff that made Splash great is still intact. But speaking of the story, the plot in Tiana's is undoubtedly the biggest downgrade. As I mentioned earlier, Splash was particularly good at telling its story. It had a very clear plot structure, which is very difficult for rides to pull off successfully. The plot of Tiana's is muddy and unclear in comparison. The queue takes you through Tiana's Foods, her worker-owned company, which acts as the setting for the ride. And as I mentioned before, Tiana then recruits you for that party in order to collect some special spices. But how we contribute to that is unclear, and in fact, I don't think there are even any spices on the entire ride. You then get turned into a frog by Odie despite not really helping at all, and then the party just happens anyway. Not to mention the critters, who are cute, but again were added solely for synergy with Critter Country. A bunch of stuff just happens, and while what's happening in each scene is clear, none of it really connects. Now, most people aren't going to care about this. I didn't really care about it that much the first time I wrote it, and people are probably just going to be there for the positive vibes. But that's also going to be a step down from Splash. Tiana's is very deliberately positive vibes only, but as a result, there's not really any tension or conflict. Now, conflict is not essential for a theme park ride, but it's something that can turn a ride from 2-dimensional into 3-dimensional. In Splash, the dread you felt in the final lift hill was real when the ominous music played and Brer Rabbit was about to get eaten. Tiana's just doesn't have any of that. And while this was a deliberate design decision, I think Tiana's is worse off for it. So I talked about what I liked about Tiana's, I talked about what I didn't like. But lastly, I want to talk about the most important thing to Tiana's, in my opinion, the politics. The number one thing you're going to hear from detractors about this ride is, it's so political, man. Oh, it's so woke. And you know what? These people are 100% correct. This ride is extremely woke. For one, and probably most obviously, Tiana's Foods is a worker-owned co-op, a clear decision to introduce kids to this concept. You then have signs in the mines that say things like, never ever lose sight of what's really important. Thank you for looking out for each other. Please call for help if you get caught in a pinch. Now, I know some people might disagree with me, but in my opinion, these are subtle pro-union messages communicating things like, we are stronger together. you are more valuable than the company. There's also other little touches of blink and you miss it wokeness, which is just so emblematic of modern Disney. In the dancing firefly scene before the final lift hill, you can make out 2 female fireflies dancing. Are they lovers? Is there a Disney ride with lesbian flies? You decide. But the answer is yes. This deliberate wokeness is, in my opinion, a clear middle finger to all of the conservatives who cried outrage whenever Tiana's was announced. And if you're one of those people upset by this, or just wokeness in general, I want to ask you, why are you so upset by kids being introduced to these alternative ideas? If the existence of a worker-owned co-op and a Disney ride is political, then the deliberate exclusion of such a co-op is also a political decision. If including LGBT relationships in media is political, then so is exclusively heterosexual relationships. You can't call something out as political just because it doesn't represent the status quo. That's not what political means. If you're against these concepts spreading to the younger generation, then you're just scared that your ideas aren't going to beat these new ones. The purpose of inclusivity, especially on a ride like this, is to normalize things like women can like women. There are alternatives to capitalism. There are such things as worker-owned co-ops that exist that may or may not interest you. I unironically believe that having a worker-owned co-op being in 2 of the biggest rides and 2 of the most popular theme parks in the world is a huge deal. And I'm not even a super pro-union guy or anything like that. It's not my main cause, but kids everywhere are going to be asking their parents what a co-op is, something that a lot of their schools probably aren't willing to do. When I was in school, I didn't even really realize what a union was. It was like a vocabulary word that had 1 paragraph devoted to it in our entire history textbook. In an age where, as we saw, governments are censoring more and more of what kids can learn about in school, it's important to have other avenues to introduce these ideas to them. And kids deserve to know that these ideas exist. To deny young people the opportunity of learning about these things because you're too scared that these ideas are going to be yours is frankly pussy behavior. And at the end of the day, no matter how tough you think you are with your open carry handgun, you're still terrified at the thought of your daughter learning that 2 women can love each other. So if you're crying and shitting and pissing because you believe that Tiana's is an affront to your conservative beliefs, you should, because it is. So stay mad. So I also wanted to share my experience riding Tiana's for the first time at Disneyland. And while the ride itself isn't too different, my experience was very unique because I was actually there for opening day. And in fact, this isn't a joke. I was actually officially the first person to ride Tiana's in Disneyland. Unofficially. Let me explain. On Thursday, November 13th, I was there for Disneyland's media preview event for Tiana's Bayou Adventure. To be clear, I wasn't invited, but I was around in the park. That day, I hung out by Tiana's a good bit, and there were a lot of high-profile Imagineers, some Disney media people I recognized, as well as actors from Princess and the Frog. I specifically remember walking away from Tiana's to go do something else, and this guy came with this big booming voice. He had this green sweater vest on, talking in my direction, saying something like, "Oh no, I haven't got the chance to actually go on it yet." And it gave me pause because I knew I recognized his voice from something, and it ended up being from Cyberpunk 2077, and I was like, who is that guy? After some Googling, I discovered it was Michael Leon Woolley, who is the voice of Lewis. I was also looking around the gift shop for Tiana's, and I recognized Sharita Carter dressed down in a hoodie with a camera crew around her, but they weren't filming her. They were filming this older lady and her family, and I knew it was something important, so I just kind of creepily lingered in the background while they were shooting this video. And then when they left and I got out of the store, I did some more Googling, and I saw it was the family of Leah Chase, who was the real-life inspiration for Tiana. This footage that you're seeing was actually what they were shooting at the time. I checked every single frame. Unfortunately, you can't see me in any of this. I think I was behind the camera person, but yes, this was what they were filming, this little social media video. Finally, as I was leaving New Orleans Square, I saw this woman in this really elaborate, beautiful green dress with like 5 security guards around her getting her picture taken. And then I recognized it was Anika Nani Rose, who is the voice of Tiana. A little bit later, I was in line for Haunted Mansion Holiday, and I did make eye contact with her as she was walking, and I took this creep shot of her because I didn't want to be weird, but maybe taking this photo was even weirder, so I don't know. Anyway, it was really cool to be there for a media preview event, even if I wasn't actually invited to the after party at night. Disneyland shut down all of New Orleans Square for the last hours of the night, and by all accounts, the media event went off without a hitch. But the same could not be said for the official opening of the ride, which was that Friday. Disneyland opened Tiana's West on November 15th, 2024, which was also the same day that kicked off the holiday season. A lot of the press stayed there after the Tiana's media event just to cover all the holiday offerings that they were having that week, which I'm sure was deliberate timing on Disney's part. The park was going to be very busy, and I knew that getting a virtual queue for Tiana's was going to be a challenge. For those who don't know, I mentioned this a little bit earlier in the video, but for Disney's newest and biggest rides, it often uses a virtual queue system that guests have to use in order to ride the attraction. This virtual queue system sticks around anywhere from a few months to even years after the ride's official opening. There are a lot of rules and fine print to this virtual queue system, but essentially, Disney releases these virtual queue spots about an hour before the park opens, as well as 1 to 2 extra times throughout the day. If you don't get a virtual queue spot, you just can't ride the ride, which really sucks. And your only option is to pay for a lightning lane, which also may be sold out. The purpose is to not have guests waiting hours in line just to experience a new attraction, but the result is really that people that are taking once-in-a-lifetime trips or once-in-a-few-years trips have this extremely anxiety-inducing experience where they absolutely need to nail this virtual queue bullshit or they're just not going to get to ride. Not to mention, and this happened when I was in Walt Disney World for Tiana's, if there is downtime for a ride with virtual queue, even when your time is called, you can still be waiting 30 to 45 minutes to get on the ride, since Disney has to prioritize all the people that paid for Lightning Lane. And worse, if there's very significant downtime and you have a later virtual queue spot, you may not even get to ride at all. To be a little bit fair, if the ride's been open a while, if you just pay attention and set some alarms on your phone, it's usually not too hard to nail a virtual queue spot. But I knew with Tiana's at Disneyland, I would be in for a fight. Now, I had just done a virtual queue for Tiana's East, and I was also around for PS5 Mania in November of 2020, so I figured I was very well prepared to click a button and enter a virtual queue. Well, I was going there with my parents, and I got them on their phones. 7 a.m. came around, we all got on and entered the virtual queue, and I was absolutely wrong. None of us got a lightning lane for Tiana's. The 7 a.m. slots for Tiana's Bayou Adventure sold out in less than a third of a second, and I immediately panicked because, obviously I wanted to ride it, and I also needed to ride it for the sake of this video. So there were two options for me to try to get on the ride. My first option was to roll the dice and try to get a slot in the afternoon release of Virtual Queue, but this was going to be even harder because now all the people that had reserved California Adventure for their first park of the day are also going to get a crack at Tiana's, so it's not going to be any easier. So then I went with my backup plan, which was to buy a lightning lane. You cannot buy any lightning lane until you scan into the park, meaning I couldn't just go on my phone right then and there and buy it. I had to be one of the first people to scan into the park. If enough people had the same idea as me and scanned in, I would be completely fucked. So Disneyland opens about 8 a.m. every day. I got to the front gates about 7:30. There was a lot of people there. I don't think it was an overwhelming amount of people, but given the excitement of Tiana's as well as the holidays, it was a pretty thick crowd of people. So then I used a very specific trick, which I will not be sharing here, to find the quickest lane and get into the park as soon as possible. So I scanned my Magic Band with my finger hovering over the Lightning Lane purchase button for me and my parents, and as soon as my Magic Band tapped the ticket booth, I just spammed the purchase button. Once I got my multi-pass, I was able to book a Lightning Lane for Tiana's at about 10:40 a.m., and I immediately felt enormous relief. 10:40, pretty early in the day, so unless the ride just never opened, I was pretty much guaranteed to get to ride. So that was really cool, but I was also out around $108 to buy it for me and my parents, so that was not very cool. So I got to rope drop relatively early and was about 6 people back from the front. Another element of Disney rope dropping is the park opens at 8 a.m., but they let you in the gates about a half hour early, so you can line up at whatever entry point you want, and then there's just this big mob of people as everyone goes to the attraction that they want to most in the day, and with basically no wait. And even though I wasn't going to be able to ride it yet, I at least wanted to head straight for Tiana's, just see what was going on over there and see some of the first people get on the ride. There was a lot of people lined up at the Adventureland entry of Disneyland, which is debatably the quickest way to get to Tiana's Bayou Adventure. I guess in the end it didn't really matter because unless you won the lottery and either got a lightning lane for 8 a.m. or were part of the first virtual queue, you weren't going to get to ride anyway, but I guess other people also wanted to just gauge the situation. And then at 8 a.m. sharp, the ropes dropped. and about 75% of the people waiting went to Indiana Jones, which I can't blame them. I guess it would be pretty stupid to waste your rope drop experience going to a ride that you couldn't even get on yet. So anyways, I headed to Tiana's, which I couldn't even get on yet. Now mind you, Disney was almost treating this day as if a new land was opening, because Critter Country was being renamed to Bayou Country, although outside of Tiana's, there really wasn't too many updates to the overall land itself, but they'll take any excuse to celebrate and get people excited to spend money. And as part of this pseudo land opening, there were a good amount of Imagineers on site to create hype and welcome people into this semi-new land. So there I was, all this pomp and circumstance, brand new land, and wouldn't you know, everything was broken. Not only was Tiana's having a delayed opening for its debut, but Winnie the Pooh, the only other ride in the land, was also down. Hungry Bear also usually doesn't open first thing in the morning, so besides like getting a cookie at Pooh Corner, there was literally nothing to do in this brand new land. It was kind of a sad sight, to be honest, because you had all these Imagineers who were probably looking forward to this day for a while, and there was just nothing to show for it. All of a sudden, these engineers who had come to celebrate the ride opening had to answer all these customer service questions about the virtual queue and why the ride was down. Just kind of a weird vibe. And as a guest, I couldn't help but feel just a little bit snubbed, because the ride seemed to work flawlessly when all the important people were there for media day, but when all the peasants are there, who cares if the ride doesn't function? And also, they kind of had the C team out there, because I consider myself somewhat knowledgeable when it comes to high-level, current working Imagineers, and there was not one person that I recognized there to be there when the ride was struggling on opening day. And I'm sure the time of these executives is valuable, but it kind of felt like they didn't want to be there to face the music of disgruntled guests if Tiana's faced the same struggles in Disneyland as it did in Magic Kingdom. But whatever, my family moved on and decided to kill some time while we waited for the ride to reopening and for our lightning lane. Around 10:40, we went back over to Tiana's to see if the situation had improved at all. The ride still did not open. There were Imagineers there answering questions, but it didn't look like there was a lot of activity going on. We were about to leave the area again, because at that point we'd only done like one ride in 3 hours, but then I saw there were some people messing around at the dispatch station. Then Lift Hill started running, and then we started seeing log cycling. And I knew that at that point, there's probably like 45 minutes-ish to the ride actually opening. So my family just plopped ourselves right outside the rope of the Lightning Lane scan-in station and stood there. Eventually, other guests kind of figured out what was going on, and so we formed this unofficial line behind us. I did witness a very funny interaction while this line was being formed. This guest, like, very pathetically tried to talk his way onto getting on the ride. He went up to a cast member and was like, is Jess working today? And the guy was like, I don't know who that is. And the guest was like, oh yeah, because I know Jess, and she said that if I mentioned her name, she'd help me out. And the cast member was like, oh, I don't know who that is. And then the guest just awkwardly walked away. It was very funny. As the ride was going through different shift changes, cast members were coming and taking photos in front of the barn. And I guess me and my family were killing their vibe, because while none of us attempted to bother them or talk to them, a few of them came up to us and were like, you know this isn't a line, right? And I was like, yeah, I know. And they were like, well, did anybody tell you to stand here? And I was like, no. And they were like, well, actually, I hate to tell you this, but the virtual queue scan-in is actually all the way back there. And I was like, no, dude, I have a lightning lane. I know what I have, and it says right there, this is where you scan in. Like, I'm not stupid. I know what's going on. You know what I'm trying to do. Like, just leave me alone. And then he went to each person behind us and tried to do the same thing, and I don't think there was one person that was in the wrong line. And no disrespect to this cast member, maybe he was just trying to avoid a situation where someone waited in that line, scanned in, and they were in the wrong spot and they got all mad. But it's like, bro, we all know what's going on here. Just let it happen. Now, as we were standing there, I started to get really excited, because I was like, holy shit, like, we are right by the barn. The virtual queue scan-in is like probably 50 yards behind us. We have a very real shot of being the first people on the ride. I crafted a game plan for my parents to make sure that we got our phones ready to go, scanning for the lightning lane so we could get in line as soon as humanly possible. And we started to see some excited chatter from the cast members. People were getting in position, and we knew minutes we'd be able to scan in and ride the ride. But then wait, what was this? This little girl and her family got to cut in front of everybody. What the hell? Now, I eventually realized that this girl and her family, it was probably like a Make-A-Wish situation, because they had cast members around them the entire time. They were hanging out by the ride the entire day. They got to ride a second time after they got on, so I feel like they were given this special treatment. But whatever, since Disney was apparently hosting them, I do not factor them into my calculations on if we were the first people to ride it. And then after the girl and her family got to go in the side gate, everyone else got to scan in. But for some reason, the virtual queue people, which were, again, 50 yards behind us, they got to scan in like 30 seconds ahead of us. So I was like, what the hell? So even though we were as fast as humanly possible scanning in for our fast pass, these people got to maliciously cut in front of us because cast members let them, which made me very unhappy. Now, I am joking here, but the cast member that was leading us through their queue was actually really cool and understood we were kind of trying to be the first people, and she really tried to rush us to the front of the line. But the virtual queue people that got to scan in ahead of us were just a little bit quicker. However, the virtual queue people, the evil cutters, were actually loaded on the log behind us. So I'm thinking maybe the cast member knew what she was doing and wanted to make sure we were the first. They saw our patience and perseverance and bravery of creating the unofficial line in front of the FastPass scan-in and said, you know what, we're going to give this family the honor of being the first log down the drain. And by first log, I mean first log with like 4 asterisks if you don't count the little girl and all of the cast member and media previews and keyholder previews that happened in the weeks prior. But yes, in some cosmic sense, we were the first people on Tiana's Bayou adventure. It was me, my mom, my dad, and this random kid we didn't know in a King Gizzard and the Wizard Lizard t-shirt. Now, as for what I actually thought about the ride itself, I'm going to keep my thoughts brief because both versions are basically identical. Just like in Florida, I did notice that certain functions on the first Lewis AA and the final Odie figure did not work, which was probably why the ride was delayed. In fact, both rides ended up getting opened around the same time, which was like 11:30, 12 p.m. So it makes me think that there might be an unofficial rule from management where if in Tiana's a figure is not fully functioning, they give it until about midday to fix before just saying screw it and opening the ride anyway. Also, during the pass holder previews, I saw a lot of conversation about how wet the ride was compared to Splash Mountain, which you can see here in this video by TPM Vids from what I assume was a media or pass holder preview. I did not get nearly that wet whenever I went, and I feel like this wetness was an unintended feature that eventually got fixed for the official opening. But just looking at the ride itself, basically every show scene is the same with some minor orientation differences. I did hear some conversation that the Disneyland version was going to be the definitive version because it was what Imagineers had in mind when designing the ride, but I actually disagree with that. The Florida version is a bit longer, and in my opinion, it's better paced. People say that because the Disneyland version is shorter, that means that it's tighter and has less empty space. But I disagree. I think that the more time you get to spend in these themed places, the better. And the idea that there's spaces in the Magic Kingdom version of just pure darkness, like some of these people pretend, is just simply wrong. So in short, while Imagineering may have had the Disneyland version in mind when crafting Tiana's Bayou Adventure, in my opinion, the optimal way to experience this ride is in Florida, riding at night, preferably with everything working. The single piece of criticism of Tiana's Bayou Adventure that is truly devoid of politics is the downtime it experiences, and so I wanted to provide a brief analysis of the data we have and give it some context. For this analysis, we're going to be using a site called thrillData.com, which pulls publicly available wait time data from Disney and other theme parks. Now, it's worth noting that this data is unofficial, and Disney could potentially skew the wait times listed publicly for business needs. However, what we're really interested in is not the wait time, but the downtime, which would be pretty much impossible for Disney to fake. Now, unfortunately, this site doesn't have downtime data for Splash Mountain, so we can't really empirically compare the downtime of Tiana's versus Splash Mountain. However, what we can do is compare this level of downtime with some of Disney's other newer rides and just see how common this level of downtime is. It's also worth noting that for some reason, Thrill Data had particularly detailed charts on Tiana's and its operations that it didn't have for any other ride. I'm not sure why that is, and although it's very helpful for our analysis of Tiana's and analyzing its downtime, I do wish it was available for all the rides because I think it's really insightful. So this chart shows how often Tiana's Bayou Adventure experiences downtime. It's a little hard to read due to a reporting glitch where it shows the current date as the ride having never opened, which is not true, but as you can see, there's a strong, consistent cluster here. Now, visually, this might look like a bunch of low wait times, but These are all clustered around the 3-hour mark, which is consistent with my theory that if an animatronic is experiencing a significant malfunction, Tiana's will close for about 3 hours up until around 11 o'clock before just opening anyway for the day. Now, the average downtime is 105 minutes per day, but the median is only 32 minutes per day. This is obviously a pretty big disparity, which tells me that when Tiana's gets going, it really doesn't experience a lot of breakdowns, but the delayed openings can really skew a lot of those extremes. This is an extremely helpful graph in that it tells us the maximum boarding group called on a particular day. This is a representation of both how much downtime the ride experienced during the day, as well as how quickly cast members were able to board guests when the ride was operating. You see this really interesting yo-yoing where Tiana's goes through these massive extremes of how many guests actually get to board in a given day. On average, 128 groups get to board a day, but based on the data, that seems like a true average, and most likely you'd be hitting one extreme or the other on any given day. Now, I've seen this chart get thrown around a lot when people are discussing how unreliable Tiana's is. But if you compare this boarding group chart with the downtime chart, as you can see, there's not this same yo-yoing that we see with the boarding group chart. This tells me that the wide variance in the boarding groups has more to do maybe with lightning lane purchases than actual ride downtime. For example, if Tiana's gets backed up with lightning lanes, that slows down the standby lines and less boarding groups get called. If this huge variance in boarding groups was only due to downtime, we would be seeing the same yo-yoing that we see with this graph. And lastly, look at this chart, which shows what percentage of the day Tiana's was closed. The average closure percentage is 19%, so a fifth of the day. Again, not where Disney wants it, but not 50-50 like some people claim that it is. But the median closure time is just 5% of the day. Again, this points to those delayed openings being the root cause of Tiana's downtime reputation. Let's look at Rise of the Resistance at Hollywood Studios, another modern Disney ride with advanced animatronics which has a reputation for being unreliable. Now, unfortunately, we can only look at the past 30 days, so it's not going to be the exact same data set as we were looking at with Tiana's, but we can still work with it. So this line is a visual representation of the average downtime, and as you can see, we have some ups and downs. Granted, not as significant as Tiana's, but some peaks and valleys nonetheless. In a 30-day period, 4 days had a total downtime of roughly 4 hours. Based on my calculations, the average downtime was 80 minutes, while the median downtime was 45 minutes. The average downtime is about 20 minutes less than Tiana's, but the median is 15 minutes longer. Rise sometimes has delayed openings, but not nearly as frequently as Tiana's, so again, this points to my theory that delayed openings are a major contributor to Tiana's reputation. And to be fair, downtime is still downtime, but there's a big difference between a ride which usually has some type of delayed opening and a ride that's just constantly breaking down all the time with guests still on it, which is the picture that pro splashers try to paint. And because Disney just doesn't make rides like they used to, let's compare Tiana's with a classic dark ride, and just keeping with the Walt Disney World theme, let's do Spaceship Earth at Epcot. This ride opened in 1982, over 40 years ago, and looking at this chart, it says a lot. Again, we're just looking at 30 days, but virtually no downtime whatsoever. How about Peter Pan's Flight, another classic dark ride? Okay, a little more downtime, but usually not more than an hour each day. So what does this data tell us? Well, for one, it's very hard to compare rides that were made 50 years ago with rides that were made in 2024. Apart from you're just comparing apples to oranges in terms of ride systems, rides are getting more and more complex, way more complex than they were 50 years ago, and that just creates more opportunities for things to go wrong. This is a big reason why rides like Splash and Rise of the Resistance have the reputation that they do, even though the downtime in actuality is not as severe as people make it out to be. If you look at the downtime stats for Hagrid's Magical Creatures Motorbike Adventure at Universal, another complicated modern thrill ride notorious for downtime, we also see a pretty wide variance across 30 days. My other takeaway from this data is that, as many have speculated, this downtime is almost certainly due to the animatronics solely. When looking at Rise of the Resistance and its downtime, it doesn't have that many animatronics, and its most important one has a B mode to prevent downtime for this very reason. Its downtime has more to do with its trackless ride system. Tiana's is a log flume ride system, which are not known for being unreliable. It makes more sense that Disney doesn't want to have a bad show with animatronics not performing as intended, and so the delays happen mostly in the morning, while the other delays can be attributed to normal things like cascades and loading issues that Splash Mountain used to experience anyway. One piece of data that I would really like to see on Thrill Data is what time of day these breakdowns are happening, because I would bet my bottom dollar that the vast majority of them are taking place at park opening up until around 11 o'clock-ish, and then very little after that. Again, downtime is still downtime, but huge difference between a ride that has a good amount of delayed openings and then just a complete disaster that's just malfunctioning all the time. Now, remember what I was saying before, how Disneyland's version of Tiana's was trying to right the wrongs of the Disney World version and make it more reliable? Well, apparently that happened because Disneyland's Tiana's is already ditching virtual queue, but the same unfortunately cannot be said for Magic Kingdom's version. Now, I don't want to armchair try to diagnose what's going on because really I have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to this stuff, but I'm going to do it anyway. The theory that sunlight is leaking in and activating the ride's sensors doesn't make a ton of sense to me because even if it was interfering with the on-off signal of a log going by, it doesn't explain why some functions of the figures work and some don't. If a figure was incorrectly triggered, they would be completely still or just moving normally, and you will rarely find videos of Tiana's figures just completely frozen. It's usually just a handful of functions that aren't working. Not to mention, if sunlight was the issue, then why not just plug up the hole? It's more likely an issue with how the electrical figures are working inside Splash's show building. The improvements that Disney made for Tiana's were likely just in the animatronics itself and nothing with the actual ride system. And if that's the case, then hopefully Tiana's East will get whatever sort of upgrades the figures got in Tiana's West that will make them more reliable. But really, I'm just talking out of my ass here. TLDR, Tiana's does break down, but not nearly as much as people think, and it usually happens early in the day. Or that would have been my hypothesis. So I'm literally about to finish exporting this video and I see a ton of conversation on Twitter about how just terrible Tiana's in Disneyland has been. And a lot of this stems from a tweet from Matt Desmond, an admitted Tiana's fan who's disappointed in the current state of the ride. Based on this tweet where he highlights all of the failures of the animatronics, it seems like Tiana's West is in a worse state than Tiana's in Florida ever was. A good number of these animatronics, which are the most important part of these Disney dark rides, have significant malfunctions. I know earlier in the video I said that you'll rarely see footage of these AAs immobile, but that's becoming more and more common now. And my point then was more so that this doesn't seem to be an on-off problem with the sensors. And I still believe that. This just seems like a complete mechanical breakdown of the electric figures rather than some kind of glitch with the on-off triggering of the figures. And Disneyland, as of the recording of this video, is still ditching virtual queue. And I think that says less about the reliability of the Western Tiana's animatronics and more about how park operations is just saying, fuck it, and prioritizing churning out guests through this attraction than trying to put on a good show. Which says a lot more about the current state of Disney parks than anything else, but that's a topic for a whole other video. So now that the dust has settled on Tiana's Bayou Adventure, the question everyone's going to be asking is it better than Splash Mountain? And in my opinion, it's really hard to compare the two, not because they're so different, but because they're so similar. When you're comparing two rides that both share the same skeleton and have the same thrills and pacing, you're basically just comparing the surface level cosmetics. And I feel like this is just an exercise in futility, so I think the better question people should be asking themselves is Tiana's a success? Is the mission that Tiana set for itself complete? There's no getting around the fact that one of Tiana's Bayou Adventure's core goals was to be as inclusive and diverse as possible. Tiana's is not the first piece of art to put DEI in the heart of its mission statement, and I feel like while the positives of this definitely outweigh the negatives, there are still some drawbacks to a story like this that we can see when we look at Tiana's. While it's not the DEI mess that right-wing grifters will have you believe, I do think there's opportunity to learn from Tiana's and how to tell stories that are just as inclusive and even more engaging. And to demonstrate what I mean, I want to briefly talk about a recent video game release which also seemingly had the same DEI core mission statement as Tiana's did. On October 31st, 2024, Dragon Age Veilguard was released to much the same anti-woke mire that Tiana's was. It became a lightning rod of hate for the same incel crowd that spends all day tweeting about Splash Mountain, Park Place included. The game ended up reviewing well despite people complaining about some really pathetic things, although there were a few gripes people had that I thought were legitimate. Undoubtedly, the most infamous moment in Veilguard is this scene where a character misgenders someone who's non-binary.
While Tosh is pounding that snake's nose, she's still holding the ruby in her other hand.
Oh,
Ah, shit. They're still holding it. Sorry.
And then the character that misgenders them makes themselves do 10 push-ups as punishment, and then tries to get the rest of the group to make it a trend.
What are you doing?
Pulling a barv.
A barv?
But there's not always time for big drawn-out apologies. So when one of us screws up and we know we've screwed up, we do a quick 10 to put it right. Pulling a barv.
No, you're right. I'm pulling a barv.
And then the writers very clearly insert themselves into the dialogue and start complaining about how cis people act when they misgender someone.
Sometimes people say, oops, sorry, and hope that fixes it. but they just want to get the whole thing over with. Trust me, I know. And that's the other reason. Some people mess up and get all dramatic. They make it about them. Oh, you know, I didn't mean it right. I'd never do that on purpose. They feel so bad about it that it's on everyone else to smooth it over and make them feel better.
I didn't expect the Lords to care about the stuff. Me being non-binary.
Now, even the wokest amongst us can admit this is cringy, right? And to be clear, I'm not criticizing the game for including non-binary themes, but it's just done in such a lazy and sterile way. This isn't how real people talk, and whatever your theme is, if this is how you're going to present it to the viewer, just spelling it out and beating them over the head with it, that deserves to be called out and not just given a pass because its heart is in the right place. I saw someone on Twitter, I wish I could find the tweet, that said, every conversation in Veilguard sounds like HR is in the room, and I think it really speaks to the toothlessness that can come from a lot of these DEI-centered projects whenever they're misguided. Because you can still make an inclusive game with DEI at the center of it that still has this conflict and negativity. Not saying that Dragon Age has none of that, but a lot of these DEI projects have these same issues. And circling back to Tiana's, if there is one negative in comparison to Splash, it's that there's no conflict on the ride to get people engaged. We're told we're supposed to collect spice for the party without any real indication of how we're going to go about doing that or depictions of us collecting spice in any way. And even though we fail our mission that Tiana gave us, it didn't matter because the party happened anyway, so what was the point in Tiana even asking us for our help? I think the pendulum swings too far in the direction of everything is awesome, and the potential of a long log flume ride with a solid story structure is wasted on a story that doesn't contain any drama. Now, it might sound like a stretch to say that a ride needs to contain some type of plot with a conflict, but this is actually extremely common in sophisticated theme park rides, especially at Disney and Universal. It keeps the audience engaged and makes them feel like they're at the center of their own movie. Tiana's just does not have that, and I feel like it's worse off for it. But barring a lack of conflict and the downtime that the Walt Disney World version is currently experiencing, I think it's hard to argue that Tiana's overall isn't a success. Clearly, its goal of introducing these inclusive concepts to a future generation in a fun theme park ride was accomplished. It's a really beautiful ride, especially at night. Just like Splash Mountain or the nearby Big Thunder, the ride looks like it's carved out of the natural landscape that's been there all along. The music is great, the technology is extremely impressive when it works, and it leaves you smiling at the end. But unfortunately, a solid, enjoyable log flume dark ride just does not bring in the clicks like Disney's biggest disaster ever. That's why the negative narrative is so strong. Thankfully, the dust has finally settled on Tiana's Bayou adventure, but while this culture battle might be over, it's just one tiny step in the never-ending culture war. Now, as we wrap up this very long excursion, it's worth reiterating that Splash Mountain still does exist in Tokyo. Rumors of it closing have swirled around since Tiana's got announced, and at this point you'll see just as many rumors about it closing as there are that the Oriental Land Company is digging in its heels. It's safe to say that Japan does not have the same cultural sensitivities as America, and given Splash's popularity, I don't think that OLC is going to cave to Disney's pressure to retheme the ride. But whenever you have a ride like Splash Mountain that's culturally transplanted, at that point, I actually think that you can just see it as an innocent little ride with a bunch of cute animals. Japan just doesn't have the same history of racial injustice that America does, and so that separation of Splash Mountain from its source material becomes a lot more palatable. But again, context is very important, and Splash Mountain existing in Japan does not mean the same thing as Splash Mountain existing in America. And honestly, having such a high-profile ride that had its history rooted in racial prejudice and bigotry removed does say a lot about the current state of the American cultural landscape. You could argue that the pulse of American culture is directly in line with the company's movies and its theme parks. When the parks closed during the pandemic, their reopening ushered in a return to normalcy, even if the park experience was altered significantly. Disney just represents this insanely high bar for all ages entertainment, and so a lot of emotional stock is put into what direction the company goes. There's a lot of debate over Walt's legacy and what he would have thought of his company in 2024. Yes, he was a registered Republican, but above all, he loved progress. Disney parks are analogous to America itself in that its history is rich and beautiful, but we should also be willing to acknowledge things that are problematic. While what kind of political position Walt would have held today is up for debate, I have no doubt that he wouldn't think any ride was too sacred to scrap. Walt Disney can never remove himself from the racist time period he grew up in, but I don't believe if given the information we have access to today, he would want Disneyland to be a stagnant museum, and I don't think he would dig in his heels to keep a ride which in hindsight had racist origins. Walt made Disneyland for everyone, and if there are those who are off-put by things in his park that are inaccurate or ahistorical, I believe he would want to change them out of respect for those offended and representing America accurately. And that includes the ongoing conversations about if Frontierland, a land predicated on American expansionism and displacing the native people who live there, has a place being presented uncritically in a Disney theme park. Contrary to what chuds online believe, the true patriots are not the people that want this country to culturally regress and return to some time period in the past, but those who want this country to move forward. This is exactly why the Founding Fathers crafted the Constitution to be malleable, because they knew that the values of their time might one day become outdated. Disney should also be malleable in that even if it means a few classic rides have to be removed, we should always be asking ourselves if the rides that Americans and their families get to experience should be chained to the antiquated values of the past, which was only great for a very select population, or should they represent the future where everyone outside of the status quo feels welcome? Walt Disney had a strong reverence for America's past, but his vision was always trained on progress. He believed in an America that didn't settle and always looked at how things could be better. I can't think of anything more American than trying to push everyone forward, and that is why Walt Disney was a true patriot. And lastly, for all you conservative Disney fans, I want to speak directly to you. Stop crying about how Splash Mountain was never racist, because even if you don't care about anyone else's feelings, here's what you gotta understand. Yeah, saying Splash Mountain was racist is a generalization, and you will rarely find anyone who has a problem with what was on the actual ride. But the truth is that it's just a really dumb move for Disney to keep a ride that's based on a movie that they can't acknowledge that's considered racist by 90% of the population. Even if you don't think that Song of the South or Splash Mountain are racist, you can at least acknowledge how that would be a problem. Life goes on, man. We cannot be having the same conversation every time a ride gets replaced. Disney is not a museum, and believe me, I also get very upset when one of my favorite rides goes on the chopping block. But this is going to happen for the rest of our lives. Theme park rides, as well as actually important things in our lives, will one day come to an end, and we need to learn to let go. Would Walt want Disneyland to stay the same or grow and improve? Now, chew on that, and then apply that logic to things in this world that actually do matter. Because there's a lot of vulnerable people in this world whose concerns are a lot bigger than the closure of a theme park ride or a gay person in a kid's movie. The fact that a ride closure is this important to you, that it's affecting your mood so much, I just want you to realize how lucky that is. And what I think frustrates me so much about these pro splashers and why this culture war stuff interests me so much is I used to be like these people where I bought into this culture war bullshit. And then one day I woke up and realized how fucking stupid all of it is and how much of a waste of time and emotion it is. I get frustrated at the people who can't see what I saw so clearly all those years ago, but I get even more frustrated at the people that are knowingly sowing this shit for money. If there are any pro splashers that stuck around this long, just understand that you are being manipulated by people that don't give a fuck about you and are only in this for themselves. And truly last thing, I promise, while I was producing this video, a pretty significant thing happened. Donald Trump was reelected as president of the United States, and this was largely due to a wave of cultural conservatism. Disney now appears to be sheepishly caving to this pressure in that they are removing an explicit trans storyline from one of their Pixar series. Just like how Disney didn't stand up to the Don't Say Gay bill until it was too late to do anything about it, Disney is also not standing up to this brewing transphobia in this country because it's no longer politically convenient to do so. So now, after I've just went on for 2 hours about how Disney went woke and that's okay, is it true that Disney doesn't actually care about DEI or any of this diversity stuff? Was the entire concept for Tiana's pure panic mode in the wake of the George Floyd murder, as many have suspected? Is Disney a company whose sole interest is money, and is debating their politics a complete waste of time? Yup.